Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity settles in beside you, and the vast, tangled mysteries of the universe are softened into something you can drift along with as you rest. Tonight's quiet path leads us toward a story whispered in clay tablets, math, memory, and myth. A story about a wandering world that some say once came close enough to ours to stir oceans, tilt ages, and leave a long, trembling echo in the oldest lines we've ever carved into stone. A world that appears on the edge of astronomy and folklore like a traveller who only visits when everything is about to change. A world called Nibiru. Before we wander too far into ancient skies and uncertain orbits, I'd like to know where you're listening from right now and what the hour looks like for you. Maybe it's late and the night has already wrapped around your room like a soft blanket. Maybe the sun is still up and the day is winding down at its own pace. Wherever you find yourself, I'm glad you're here, sharing this slow, steady moment in a universe that doesn't always feel steady at all. And if this calm space brings you a little comfort, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this quiet corner find others who might want a gentle break from the noise. Now breathe out for a moment. Let whatever weight you carried into this evening loosen, even just a little, because we're about to step into a story that's been argued over for centuries, a story that stretches between astronomy and superstition, between numbers and legends, between what we can prove and what we can't quite let go of. A story that has fascinated historians, terrified doomsday writers, and captivated dreamers who look up at the night sky and wonder whether something once looked back. The idea that a rogue world might have drifted near Earth in the distant past has lived through countless retellings. It appears under different names across different cultures, sometimes as a god, sometimes as a force of nature, sometimes as both. And whether Nibiru was a real planet, a misunderstood object, or a metaphor woven into ancient stories, the thought of it changes the way we think about the deep past. Because if a world truly passed close enough to ours long ago, even for a brief moment, it could have reshaped tides, weather, and civilizations in ways we barely understand. Even a slight gravitational gesture from a passing giant could have nudged Earth's rhythm into a different melody, one that humans then had to learn and adapt to with whatever tools they had at the time. It's strange how an idea can sit between science and myth, and somehow feel at home in both. The ancient scribes of Mesopotamia wrote about celestial bodies with a precision that still surprises researchers. They charted the movements of planets, comets, and stars like people who believed that the sky held instructions, warnings, and quiet reminders about the order of things. When they spoke of Nibiru, they weren't describing a bedtime story. They were describing something powerful enough to earn a place in their most serious texts, something that crossed the heavens with purpose, something that didn't behave like the other wanderers they tracked so carefully. Some descriptions paint Nibiru as a marker of transition, arriving when ages ended and new eras began. Others describe it as a world belonging to the gods, a crossing point where the sky seemed to open and allow something from far away to step in. And as these stories travelled across centuries, merging with other traditions and interpretations, the idea transformed again and again. Sometimes it became a sign of destruction. Sometimes it became a harbinger of wisdom. Sometimes it became a warning about cycles that repeat long after civilizations have forgotten the last time they unfolded. But the core of the idea remained the same. Something in the distant past moved across the sky in a way that humans could not ignore. And whatever it was, it left a trace deep enough to survive thousands upon thousands of years. Modern astronomers don't take the idea lightly either. The universe is filled with wandering bodies. Rogue planets slip between stars with no home. Icy giants drift in elongated orbits lasting tens of thousands of years. Debris from ancient collisions travels silently through space, occasionally passing close enough to planets to cause measurable effects. Even within our own solar system, there are cycles and interactions still not fully understood, motions that take centuries to complete, influences that reveal themselves only when enough data has been gathered to show a pattern that wasn't obvious before. So when people ask whether a world once passed close to Earth, the answer isn't automatically no. It isn't automatically yes either. Instead, it sits somewhere in the middle, balanced like a coin resting on its edge, waiting for evidence or memory or a new discovery to tilt it one way or the other. Part of what makes this story compelling is that it refuses to settle into a single explanation. Something that draws from both science and myth often does this. It lingers in the in-between places, in the spaces where certainty hasn't yet grown. Imagine a night thousands of years ago. The sky is unbroken darkness spilling across an ancient landscape. There are no city lights, no engines humming, no screens glowing. Just people gathered around fires watching the heavens because there wasn't much else to watch. And then something appears, something bright, unfamiliar, moving in a way that doesn't match the steady rhythm of known stars. It might have looked like a wandering torch dragged across the sky by an invisible hand. It might have looked like an omen. It might have looked like a visitor. Whatever it was extraordinary enough that entire civilizations remembered it. Extraordinary enough that its presence became woven into myths that outlasted the people who first saw it. Maybe it moved slowly. Maybe it hung in the sky for weeks or months, giving people time to speculate, fear, celebrate or prepare. Maybe it shifted the tides or chilled the air or unsettled animals, creating a cascade of small disturbances that felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And if it passed close enough, even if only once, even if only for a brief part of its orbit, it could have left subtle imprints on Earth's climate, geology, or magnetic field, the kind of imprints that scientists still debate today. Because that's the quiet truth hidden inside this story. You don't need a collision to change the course of history. You only need a close enough encounter, a gravitational nudge, a handful of altered seasons, a shift in patterns that ancient civilizations relied on for crops, rituals, calendars, and survival. Humans are resilient, but we're also deeply shaped by the stability of our environment. When that stability wavers, even slightly, entire eras can unfold differently. Some historians point to sudden rises and falls of early civilizations, floods that seemed too large for the rivers that caused them, droughts that lasted longer than anyone expected, cultural shifts that happened in bursts rather than gradual transitions. While none of these events prove anything about a passing world, they create a landscape of mystery that stories like Nibiru quietly grow within. When you have gaps in the record, the imagination fills them, sometimes with caution, sometimes with hope, sometimes with the memory of something the sky once revealed. Tonight, as we follow this path, we're not here to confirm or dismiss the possibility. Instead, we're here to explore why the idea persists and why it continues to ripple through conversations about our origins. We're here to look at the blend of science and story that makes this topic so compelling. And we're here to move gently through the spaces where certainty has not yet set down roots. There's also something strangely comforting about looking backward into a time when humans watched the sky with more attention than they gave anything else. They believed the heavens spoke, and perhaps in their own way they were right. Not in dramatic prophecies or fiery declarations, but in the steady patterns that guided seasons, migrations, and the fragile timeline of early human life. Something unusual in the sky would have carried immense weight. It would have shifted the stories people told their children. It would have become part of their sense of order. And sometimes those stories travel farther and endure longer than the events that inspired them. As we drift deeper into this idea, let the edges of the day soften. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of distant worlds passing near our own settle into your mind like a gentle tide. Because the story of Nibiru, whether literal or symbolic, invites us to imagine how humans responded to changes they couldn't explain. To imagine how a simple moment of awe might have shaped entire civilizations. to imagine what it means for our world to have been part of a larger cosmic dance that we're only just beginning to understand. The idea of a passing world is dramatic, yes, but it's also deeply human. It shows how much we want to make sense of the unknown, how much we want to trace the threads between events that feel disconnected until we realise there might be a single cause weaving them together. How much we want to believe that the sky remembers everything even when we forget. And as this quiet journey begins, we're not looking for fear or alarm or predictions. We're simply allowing ourselves to step into the old stories, the ancient patterns, the uncertain evidence, and the lingering possibility that something once brushed past Earth and left a faint but lasting mark. A moment when two worlds came close enough to influence each other before drifting apart again. So settle in. The night is long enough. The sky is wide enough. And the story of a wandering world is just beginning to unfold as we drift toward the next part of this journey, where the planet that shouldn't exist but refuses to leave our myths waits on the horizon like a distant traveller preparing to step into view. There's a particular kind of visitor that shows up often in humanity's oldest stories, a celestial wanderer that drifts through myth the way a forgotten melody drifts through memory. You hear it faintly in one culture, then again in another 1,000 miles away, and though the names change, the impression remains almost stubbornly familiar. A world that wasn't supposed to be here. A world that didn't fit neatly into the order of the known heavens. A world that appeared only at turning points, leaving people to wonder whether it was an omen, a sign, or something else entirely. This is the world later storytellers called Nibiru, the one that stands on the threshold between fact and folklore, refusing to leave either one behind. When ancient scribes carved their earliest records, they weren't writing bedtime stories. They were writing history as they understood it, blending observation with meaning because, in their view, those two things belonged together. The sky wasn't just decoration. It was an active participant in the fate of the world. The movement of a single bright object could determine when to plant crops, when to prepare for floods, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. So when an object appeared that didn't behave like the predictable wanderers they already knew, it would have been impossible to ignore. The earliest hints come from Mesopotamia, where the sky was charted with remarkable consistency long before modern telescopes existed. Their astronomers tracked the planets with sharp, practical attention. Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Mercury, each had a known cycle. Each had patterns that could be followed, anticipated, understood. But every so often the texts referenced something that didn't fit these cycles, something that crossed rather than circled, something that arrived from a direction that didn't align with the usual paths, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Modern scholars debate the meaning of these records. Some argue it was a poetic way of describing Jupiter's position during certain years. Others believe it referenced a comet or an unusual alignment. Yet others suggest that whatever it was, the ancient scribes believed it to be more than an astronomical curiosity. They believed it mattered. This ambiguity is part of what keeps the idea alive. A planet that shouldn't exist has a way of lingering in the imagination. The known planets move with predictable grace. But this one, if it existed, would have had a path far stranger. A long orbit that carried it far from the centre of the solar system for most of its journey, only returning now and then in intervals so vast that a single civilization might witness its passage once, or never at all. A world like that wouldn't show up in the regular patterns that guided ancient life. It wouldn't fit into the charts the scribes used. Instead, it would appear suddenly, bright enough or unusual enough that observers would have to invent new language just to describe it. And when something forces you to create new language, it tends to leave a mark. Later cultures inherited fragments of these stories, and Nibiru shifted in shape as it travelled through time. For some, it became a star that signalled the arrival of a new age. For others, it was a celestial crossing point, a place where divine forces moved between realms. Over centuries, the idea accumulated layers. It became the vessel of gods, the bringer of upheaval, the herald of a turning world, not because people were easily frightened, but because the sky was one of the few constants they had. When something in that sky changed, even slightly, it must have felt like the universe itself was adjusting its posture. There are moments in mythology where the same story appears in different cultures with only minor changes, as if multiple civilizations witnessed something similar and interpreted it in the context of their own beliefs. Floods that arrive without warning. Periods of disorder framed as cosmic resets. Migrations sparked by sudden environmental shifts. These stories don't prove anything about a wandering planet, yet they create a landscape where such an idea can live. A world that wasn't supposed to be there becomes easier to imagine when so many ancient narratives describe moments that feel abrupt or unexplainable. In more modern times, the idea resurfaced when researchers began re-examining old texts with fresh eyes. Some saw references to an object on a long, elongated orbit. Others saw echoes of astronomical cycles that take thousands of years to complete. A few believed they had found evidence of a body large enough to classify as a planet, hidden in the outer reaches of the solar system, tugging subtly on known objects in ways that hinted at its presence. This sparked debates that continue even now. The hypothetical Planet 9 proposed by contemporary astronomers is not the same as Nibiru, but its possibility opens a familiar door. When you admit that a large, distant planet may exist beyond current detection, the boundary between myth and hypothesis grows thinner. Even if Nibiru wasn't a literal world, the stories suggest a human instinct to explain sudden change by pointing upward. Ancient civilizations faced events they couldn't predict. Droughts that stretched on without reason. Rivers that spilled beyond their banks in ways that didn't align with known seasonal patterns. Shifts in temperature or wind that disrupted the cycles of life. When such things happened, people often looked to the sky for the cause. If a stranger appeared there, brighter than usual or moving in unfamiliar ways, it would have been easy to see it as the missing piece of a puzzle no one had been able to solve. That's how a planet that isn't supposed to exist becomes something that never leaves our myths. It offers an explanation for uncertainty. It provides a narrative for sudden change. It gives structure to events that might otherwise feel random or overwhelming. And even after the original observers are gone, their stories remain, carried forward by generations who may not remember the details, but remember how the story felt. Something unusual arrived. It caused a shift. Life afterward was different. Astronomically, planets with long orbits aren't unusual. We've found examples in other star systems, worlds that take centuries or even millennia to complete a single lap around their suns. Some travel so far from the warmth of their star that they drift close to being lost entirely before gravity pulls them back again. In a universe filled with wanderers, the idea of one passing near Earth in the distant past isn't inherently impossible. Rare, yes. Dramatic, absolutely. But the cosmos is large enough for rare things, and the history of our planet is long enough that brief encounters could have unfolded beyond the reach of written records. A close pass wouldn't need to be catastrophic to earn a place in myth. A small gravitational influence can create outcomes that ripple across centuries. A few degrees of climate fluctuation, a shift in ocean patterns, a temporary disruption of weather cycles. Early civilizations lived close to the edge of survival. A handful of altered seasons could have reshaped entire societies. If people survived the shift, they would have tried to explain it. The sky, with its untouchable authority, would have been the first place they looked. Nibiru became the symbol of that skyborne influence, a name that held both fear and fascination. A way of acknowledging that sometimes the world changes in ways that feel too large for human scale. Even now, long after those ancient civilizations faded into dust and memory, the name resurfaces whenever people feel a sense of uncertainty about the wider cosmos. It's a reminder that we are part of a solar system still full of mysteries, still shifting quietly in ways that don't always make their presence known. Every era has its version of the planet that shouldn't exist. In the age of early star charts, it was Nibiru. In the era of telescopes, it became the search for unknown planets, pulling on the orbits of Neptune and Uranus. Today, it appears in discussions of hypothetical distant bodies that might explain unexplained motions at the edge of the solar system. Each version fills the same role. It provides a placeholder for phenomena we haven't yet fully understood. It keeps alive the idea that discovery is far from finished. Consider how long it took for astronomers to confirm the existence of Neptune. Mathematical predictions came first, based on slight irregularities in Uranus's orbit. No one could see the unseen planet yet, but its influence hinted at something massive lurking in the dark. When Neptune was finally observed, it proved that even the familiar solar system could still surprise us. And even Neptune wasn't the final piece. Something else still tugged at the edges of the outer planets, leading to Pluto's discovery decades later. Even after that, additional irregularities persisted, sparking searches for even larger unseen worlds. Some of these searches were eventually explained by better measurements. Others simply grew quiet, waiting for new data. In that context, the persistence of a Nibiru-like idea makes sense. A world that hides most of the time and reveals itself only rarely fits the pattern of discoveries that have shaped astronomy. The difference is that the mythic version carries emotion and symbolism that science alone doesn't usually offer. It connects the heavens to human fate, blending the movement of planets with the movement of history. That's what keeps the idea alive. It's not just about whether a world exists, it's about the story it tells. A planet that lingers at the edge of detection is a powerful metaphor for all the things humans sense but can't prove. Uncertainty, change, the feeling that life shifts without warning. Ancient storytellers used Nibiru to explain those moments. Modern storytellers use science to ask whether something like it could still be out there. The two approaches aren't opposed. They're different languages describing the same impulse, a desire to understand why things happen the way they do. And even if a wandering world never came near Earth, the idea reflects something true about us. We watch the sky not just to measure it, but to interpret it. The heavens have been our oldest companion, guiding us long before compasses or clocks existed. When something unaccounted for appears in that expanse, it affects us deeply. We're wired to look for meaning, for patterns, for ways to connect our lives to something larger. So when a story about a mysterious planet refuses to disappear, it reveals how strongly we hold to the belief that the universe has more to show us than we currently understand. Nibiru stays in our myths because it captures the essence of that belief. It's the possibility that something vast once brushed past our world. It's the memory of change that came from the sky. It's the quiet suggestion that we may not be as isolated in the cosmos as we sometimes think. And even though centuries of debate have woven thick layers of interpretation around the idea, the core remains simple. A world that wasn't supposed to be here might have been here, if only briefly. A stranger passing by. A shadow crossing the sky. A moment when the universe reminded early humans that their world was part of something far bigger. As this quiet journey continues, the next part moves toward the places where those echoes first appeared. The early civilizations that watched the heavens carefully and recorded hints of something they couldn't fully name, leaving behind clues that have lingered far longer than the observers who carved them into clay. Long before telescopes and satellites and glow-in-the-dark star charts, long before the sky became something we measured with instruments instead of instinct, people watched the heavens with a kind of attention that feels almost impossible to imagine now. Their nights were quieter, their horizons wider, their days shaped by rhythms they depended on so completely that any disruption, even a subtle one, carried the weight of a sign. And when the heavens behaved in ways that didn't match the familiar patterns, their response wasn't curiosity alone, it was fear. Not the frantic kind that sends people running, but a deeper, steadier fear that something larger than themselves had shifted, something that might reshape the fragile order of their world. These early civilizations left behind records that have survived far longer than their walls. Clay tablets hardened by fire, stones carved with symbols, fragments of myths etched into pottery or painted across temple corridors. They're quiet things now, tucked into museum drawers or resting behind glass, but they were once urgent messages, warnings, observations, attempts to make sense of nights when the sky changed and people felt the change in their bones. In Mesopotamia, where writing first settled into clay as if it had been waiting millennia to be discovered, the sky was not a backdrop. It was a living map. Sumerian priests watched it from rooftops, tracking the rise and fall of familiar wanderers, marking their positions with careful precision. They knew when Venus should appear. They knew the motions of Jupiter's stately path. They knew the slow, patient return of Mars. These patterns weren't just interesting, they were essential. The entire structure of their world, the timing of agriculture, religious festivals, civic duties, even political decisions, leaned on the reliability of celestial motion. So when something appeared that did not follow those patterns, it was recorded with the gravity of an earthquake. Some tablets describe an object that moved differently from the others, lingering where no known planet should linger, brightening in unexpected ways, shifting in a path that didn't match anything the scribes had documented over generations. They wrote about it with an almost clinical tone, as if they were trying to keep their hands steady while describing something that made them deeply uneasy. They called it a star of crossing, or a wandering omen depending on the text. Later interpretations tied these descriptions to the idea of Nibiru, though the ancient accounts themselves were more ambiguous. They didn't name it as a world. They didn't describe its size. They simply recorded that it was there and that its arrival mattered. In those days, fear was woven tightly into reverence. Seeing something unfamiliar in the sky wasn't just frightening for practical reasons. It was frightening because it felt intentional. Messages from the heavens were not metaphors, they were instructions, and if the heavens changed their message, people assumed the world itself was about to follow. The Babylonian Akkadian omen texts are some of the most compelling echoes of this mindset. They describe celestial appearances that foreshadowed droughts, floods, political upheaval, or the rise of new rulers. The logic wasn't random. It was part of an ancient system of interpretation that connected the sky to the land in a single thread. When the thread trembled, everything trembled with it. Archaeologists sift through these texts with cautious hands, aware that some details are symbolic and others observational, yet patterns emerge. Certain descriptions reappear across centuries, long after the scribes who first wrote them turned to dust. A bright object in an unfamiliar region of the sky. A movement that crosses the paths of known planets. A period of visibility that seems too long for a comet, yet too short for a typical planet. A return that appears irregular, as if its orbit were far longer than the civilizations who first saw it could measure. Whether these records refer to a real celestial body or a symbolic one remains a matter of debate, but the fact that they were carved into clay again and again reveals something important. These people experienced a moment when the sky behaved differently, and they chose not to forget it. The echoes aren't isolated to Mesopotamia. In Egypt, the night sky was a text of its own, written not on clay but across temple ceilings and astronomical ceilings painted in blues and golds. Egyptian priests measured the heliacal rising of Sirius with exquisite accuracy, linking it to the Nile's flood and the renewal of the land. Their star charts were both mathematical and spiritual, entwining cosmic order with earthly harmony. Yet even in these carefully structured traditions, there are hints of disturbances, texts that speak of stars appearing unexpectedly, lights brightening beyond normal intensity, visitors in the heavens whose arrival corresponded with upheaval on earth. Egyptian writings often frame these events as manifestations of gods or symbols of cosmic imbalance. When something bright and unfamiliar showed itself against the desert sky, it landed not only in the astronomical archive, but also in the mythology that shaped their worldview. Civilizations that depended on predictable celestial cycles reacted strongly when those cycles faltered. In the Indus Valley, where writing remains only partially deciphered, the hints are more subtle. Archaeological evidence shows sudden population shifts, changes in settlement patterns, and signs of environmental stress occurring around periods that align with significant climatic anomalies. While these patterns do not explicitly mention celestial causes, later Vedic texts from the broader region reference skyborne omens connected to floods, droughts, and the shifting fortunes of kingdoms. These stories, transmitted orally long before they were written, may echo events that earlier cultures lived through without leaving direct written explanations. Farther east, in China, records dating back thousands of years demonstrate a persistent attention to unusual celestial phenomena. Ancient astronomers documented comets, novae, eclipses, and meteors with methodical care. When something brighter or stranger appeared, court historians noted it with the weight of a national event. Chinese texts describe guest stars that arrived suddenly and broom stars that swept across the sky. While most of these observations now align with known astronomical objects, a handful remain ambiguous. Too slow to be meteors, too erratic to be planets, too bright to be ordinary stars. Across continents, stories surface of a sky that once looked different. Sometimes the descriptions resemble a great fire, sometimes a red star with an unusual tail, sometimes an object so bright that it casts shadows at night. These accounts cannot be taken as direct evidence of a single event, but their persistence across distant regions raises the question of whether ancient civilizations, separated by enormous distances, were responding to a shared celestial experience. When we look at the archaeological and textual fragments together, a pattern emerges, not of a single shared narrative, but of cultures independently attempting to record something they perceived as larger than themselves, something that arrived unexpectedly, something that did not fit comfortably within their established cosmology. Fear plays a complicated role in these records. It wasn't panic or chaos. It was the soft, heavy fear of uncertainty, the kind that settles over community slowly when the patterns that sustain life begin to shift. If a bright object appeared in the sky at the same time the river behaved strangely, or the crops failed, people would naturally draw connections. They didn't have modern meteorology or climate science. They had the rhythm of the year, and when that rhythm stumbled, they looked outward. Imagine a small settlement near the Euphrates thousands of years ago. Farmers tending their fields, priests watching the stars, families preparing for the changing seasons. Then, one night, a light appears where no light has ever been. It doesn't behave like the others. It seems to cross rather than follow. It lingers. Over the following months, the weather shifts unpredictably. The river floods more violently than usual, or perhaps it recedes too quickly. The harvest falters. People begin to whisper. Priests consult their tablets. Scribes write cautiously, noting the connection without daring to claim causation outright. These scenarios played out in countless environments across the ancient world. Civilizations built their lives around cycles, and cycles were sacred because they were stable. The sky was the keeper of that stability. When the sky changed, stability itself felt threatened. Over time, these experiences solidified into stories, and stories grew into myths. Myths blended with rituals. Rituals carried meaning through generations. Eventually, the original event, whatever it was, receded into the background, leaving only the narrative frame, a bright wanderer, a moment of upheaval, a shift in the balance of the world. Archaeology continues to uncover layers of these echoes. Sites reveal sudden collapses of long-standing cultures, such as the Akkadian Empire, which faced a dramatic decline around the same period. Many ancient myths describe overwhelming environmental disruption. Clay tablets from that era speak of dust storms so intense that the sun was obscured for months. The climate data suggests rapid drying. Something shifted, and people sought explanations wherever they could find them. Some researchers propose volcanic eruptions or changes in atmospheric circulation. Others point to broader climatic cycles, and still others wonder whether a celestial encounter, however slight, could have nudged Earth's climate into a pattern it struggled to recover from quickly. None of these theories are definitive, but the multiplicity itself mirrors the ancient struggle to understand what had happened. The physical evidence left behind is often subtle. Sediment layers showing abrupt transitions, tree rings narrowing in unison across vast regions, fossilized pollen revealing years when entire ecosystems changed their behavior. In each case, the environment recorded shifts that humans later explained through the language of myth. For ancient people, the sky and the earth were inseparable. Events in one reflected events in the other. When the earth trembled, they looked up. When the sky changed, they worried about what the earth might do next. That instinct didn't disappear as civilizations grew more complex. Greek historians wrote about fiery omens that preceded disasters. Roman scholars tracked celestial signs with both fascination and apprehension. Even medieval chroniclers, centuries removed from the worlds of clay tablets and stargazing priests, described unusual lights in the sky as presages of famine or war. These accounts may not refer to a single event, but they reflect a continuity of interpretation. The sky was always the place where meaning gathered. The persistence of these echoes gives weight to the idea that ancient civilizations witnessed celestial phenomena dramatic enough to reshape their understanding of the world. Not necessarily catastrophic, not necessarily abnormal in a cosmic sense, but unfamiliar enough to leave them unsettled. A planet passing near Earth would certainly qualify, though that remains an open question. What matters for this part of the story is not proof, but perspective. These civilizations weren't inventing fears out of nothing. They were responding to a world that shifted beneath their feet and above their heads. Stone carvings from the Hittites, stelae from the Levant, codices from Mesoamerica, and inscriptions from ancient China all show how deeply intertwined sky observation and survival were. When the sky deviated, even slightly, the response was documented with the legitimacy of a historical event. These carvings and writings serve as echoes of nights when people stood outside staring upward with a mix of awe and dread as something unfamiliar traced its path across the horizon. These echoes are quiet now, but they still resonate. The clay tablets don't shout. The stones don't dramatize. They simply preserve the impressions of people who saw something they didn't expect and felt compelled to record it. Not as fantasy, not as invention, as lived experience. As this path continues, the next part moves deeper into the moment when these observers looked up and saw not just meaning, but motion. Movement in the heavens that may have altered the Earth's balance in ways they could sense, even if they couldn't explain it, forming the beginnings of a story that still reaches across millennia. There are moments in the long memory of Earth when something shifts so subtly at first that no one recognizes the warning, and then so completely that afterward nothing feels quite the same. Human stories about those moments usually begin with the sky, not because people wanted drama, but because the sky was the first place they looked whenever the world felt unsteady beneath their feet. If the familiar patterns overhead changed, even slightly, it meant that something vast had moved, and with it the delicate balance that early civilizations relied on. Whether the cause was a comet, a bright star, or something far larger drifting through the dark, the result was always the same. People lifted their eyes, held their breath, and waited. Imagining the night the sky changed isn't difficult when you place yourself in the world of those early observers. There were no city lights to soften the edges of the heavens, no screens glowing in the corners of rooms distracting from the slow rhythm of evening. Nights were long stretches of darkness broken only by firelight and stars. The sky wasn't merely visible, it was overwhelming. Every motion, every flicker, every shift was noticed by someone, and often by many. When something unfamiliar appeared against that vast canvas of darkness, it must have felt like the world was whispering a warning. The idea that a passing world could alter life on Earth sounds dramatic now, But in the vulnerability of antiquity, it wouldn't have required much to unsettle an entire society. Civilizations at that time were finely balanced ecosystems of agriculture, trade, weather, and ritual. A season of strange storms or a few years of inconsistent floods could push a flourishing region into decline. So when something appeared in the sky that didn't belong to the usual patterns, people didn't just observe it. They braced themselves. Some ancient texts describe nights when a bright object seemed to hold its place too long, as if anchored to the horizon. Others mention lights moving in unusual directions or growing brighter than anything normally seen in those seasons. These fragments are frustratingly sparse, offering just enough detail to suggest that something extraordinary occurred, but not enough to confirm what it was. That's often how ancient records work. They were written for people who already knew the context, not for those of us who would try to decipher them thousands of years later. When a scribe wrote that a star crossed the heavens where no star should be, he didn't pause to explain which region of the sky was unusual or how often such things happened. He assumed everyone reading already understood. Still, these brief lines hint at a scenario that has captivated researchers and storytellers alike. A night when a wandering world, if such a world existed, came close enough to Earth to be visible without instruments. Not close enough for collision or catastrophe, but close enough to shift tides, to tilt seasons, to change patterns in ways that might unfold slowly and unpredictably. A passing world wouldn't look like the planets we know. It wouldn't behave like Mars or Venus, rising and setting predictably. Instead, it would appear in a part of the sky people had no reason to monitor. It might brighten or dim irregularly. Its path might feel wrong, almost sideways, defying the polished cycles that civilizations trusted. Imagine an object as large as a planet threading its way through the outer reaches of the solar system, following an orbit so long and stretched that it only approached the inner worlds once in many ages. For most of its journey, it would drift through cold and distant space, invisible to any early observers on Earth. But then, at some point in its slow motion around the sun, it would return. Not for long, not aggressively, just enough to reveal itself, enough to alter gravitational balances in ways subtle at first, then progressively more noticeable. Tides are governed by the moon, but they are sensitive to any strong external influence. Even a slight gravitational pull from a passing world could stretch ocean levels in patterns unfamiliar to early fishermen or coastal dwellers. They might see water rising where it had never risen before or receding too far, disturbing fish populations or exposing sandbanks that should have remained hidden. The ocean remembers every push and pull, and ancient people lived close enough to its rhythm that even a faint disruption would have seemed ominous. Weather systems could also shift. A passing world with even a small gravitational tug might alter atmospheric patterns temporarily, nudging jet streams or changing seasonal winds. Imagine communities that relied on predictable rains waiting for clouds that never arrived, or suddenly enduring storms far stronger than usual. The land would respond with confusion. Crops would suffer. Rivers would behave unpredictably. Small changes, when layered across years, become large changes in human life. Civilizations didn't need to witness the celestial cause directly to feel its effects. By the time priests or astronomers looked up and saw something unfamiliar, the consequences might already have begun to ripple through their regions. Harvests faltering, animals migrating strangely, temperatures shifting, patterns breaking. People would naturally connect these disturbances to whatever stood out most clearly in their world, and nothing stood out more sharply than a new star or wandering light in the night sky. Ancient mythology often describes periods when the heavens appeared to lean closer to Earth. Stories of red stars, blazing gods, or celestial fires may be poetic, but they might also be rooted in attempts to describe something beyond normal experience. People reach for metaphor when reality stretches beyond familiar language. A planet glowing faintly in the distance might have been described as a burning god descending from the sky. A bright, wandering object could be interpreted as a divine messenger carrying warnings. The more unusual the sight, the more dramatic the language needed to describe it. Beyond mythology, archaeological records show abrupt collapses in certain ancient civilizations happening within narrow time windows. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, the Akkadian Empire, the Harappan cities of the Indus Valley, all experienced periods of sudden environmental strain followed by social upheaval. While each region had its own local challenges, some researchers have noted that many of these disruptions occurred within overlapping centuries. Whether that overlap is coincidence, climatic cycles, or the fingerprint of something larger remains unknown. If a passing world nudged Earth into a slightly altered axial tilt or influenced long-term climatic patterns, the results would unfold slowly but powerfully. A few degrees of temperature change could turn fertile lands into marginal ones. Slight irregularities in monsoons could disrupt entire agricultural systems. Civilizations that thrived under specific conditions would struggle to adapt. As people migrated or reorganized, stories about why the world had changed would multiply and evolve. Some of those stories would point to the sky. The idea of a single celestial event stirring multiple empires might sound improbable, but Earth's history contains examples of distant events shaping the planet's surface. The gravitational influence of Jupiter affects the orbits of comets that occasionally approach Earth. The cycles of the Sun influence climate patterns that can alter societies over generations. A wandering world passing at a respectful but influential distance would not break the planet, but it might coax it into a slightly different rhythm. That shift could create ripple effects that societies then interpreted in their own ways. Mesopotamian scribes might write of omens and divine portents. Egyptian priests might speak of gods rising in unfamiliar forms. Chinese astronomers might document a strange guest star whose presence troubled the emperor. And in Mesoamerica, the appearance of an unfamiliar object could become woven into later myths about ages ending and beginning, cycles of renewal shaped by forces beyond human comprehension. The night itself would be remembered differently depending on where people lived. In some places, the object might have appeared low on the horizon, creating an eerie glow that lingered long enough to unsettle entire communities. In others, it might have arced across the sky with a slow, deliberate path that made it impossible to ignore. In lands where astronomy was tightly connected to politics, rulers might have feared the loss of legitimacy if the heavens appeared displeased. In agricultural societies, farmers might have seen it as a sign that seasons were about to shift. Stories would reflect these concerns, shaping myths that persisted long after the object itself faded back into darkness. Fear wasn't the only emotion present on such a night. There would also have been awe. A sky that changes unexpectedly can be terrifying, but it can also draw people closer to one another, binding them in shared wonder. Imagine families gathering outside their homes, pointing at the strange light overhead. Imagine priests climbing temple steps, clutching tablets and instruments, trying to stay calm as they recorded details they didn't yet understand. Imagine children staring upward, not fearful but fascinated, their memories of that night becoming stories they passed down to their own descendants. Even without instruments, early astronomers would have attempted to track the object's motion. They might have marked its position relative to familiar stars, noting slight shifts night by night. They would have debated its meaning, compared it to earlier records, and searched for explanations within their cosmologies. Their efforts would not have been academic. They believed the sky communicated with them. Understanding the message was a responsibility, not a curiosity. Over time, as the object continued on its path and eventually faded from view, the immediate fear might have softened, but the memory remained. The world that came after felt different. Crops didn't behave as they once had. Rivers altered their paths. Winters lengthened or shortened. People adapted as they always do, but with a sense that something had happened, something too large to fully comprehend. Some historians suggest that the abrupt cultural steps taken during these periods, new religious practices, shifts in political structures, changes in trade routes, reflects societies trying to restore balance they believed had been disturbed. It wasn't that they attributed every hardship to the sky. It was that the sky was part of the explanation when everything else felt uncertain. The night the sky changed didn't need to be a single event. It could have been part of a series, a comet one year, a bright wanderer the next, climate anomalies unfolding over decades. To the people living through it, these events would have been connected. Their stories reflect that. They don't describe isolated astronomical observations. They describe eras of transition framed by signs in the heavens. Even now, long after the fear faded, the echoes of that experience survive. They survive in myths of worlds that approach and depart. They survive in stories of celestial crossings that heralded new ages. They survive in records that describe the sky opening, or a star that moved against the expected order. These fragments carry traces of the emotional landscape of those nights, half dread, half awe, fully aware that the world was larger and stranger than anyone could fully grasp. As this narrative continues, the next part moves toward the long consequences of these changes, looking at how the aftermath shaped the paths of early civilizations, and how the ripples of a passing world may have influenced human history in ways that still linger quietly beneath the surface of the stories we tell. When ancient civilizations tried to make sense of the world around them, they often reached back into memories of catastrophe, moments when the earth seemed to heave under their feet, or the sky poured down its fury without warning. These memories were rarely written the way we might expect a record of disaster to read today. They weren't lists of dates or measurements. They were stories. They were warnings. They were explanations for why life had suddenly changed, and why the old ways no longer worked as they once had. And woven through these accounts is a quiet pattern, a suggestion that at least some of these catastrophes didn't unfold on their own. Something may have nudged the world first, shifting the balance just enough to send rivers spilling from their banks, forests crackling in unexpected heat, or climates trembling into new configurations. Floods appear so often in the oldest stories that it's almost strange to imagine a world without them. But the floods described in early myths weren't gentle seasonal rises. They were overwhelming, consuming, relentless events that drowned entire regions and reset the landscape. Mesopotamia's flood stories are the best known, but variations echo across continents. In Sumerian tablets, a flood arrives with such force that even the gods seem startled. In later Babylonian texts, the waters rage for so long that survival becomes a rare miracle, and in neighbouring cultures similar accounts appear. Rivers overflowing beyond anything people had seen before, storms arriving in strange seasons, rain falling in quantities that felt unworldly. Archaeology supports parts of these stories. Sediment layers from some regions show abrupt transitions from dry conditions to thick deposits of waterborne debris. Settlements once thriving along riverbanks were suddenly abandoned, their foundations buried beneath layers of silt heavy enough to suggest an event that lasted longer and behaved differently than expected seasonal floods. Something disrupted the normal patterns, and societies responded by encoding these disruptions into the language of myth. Fires have their own place in this archive of memory. Ancient literature describes flames consuming forests with a speed and ferocity that made the events feel supernatural. Some stories speak of fire falling from the sky, others of suns burning hotter than before, drying the land until it could ignite with a single spark. Across regions, oral traditions speak of times when crops died in the fields, not because people neglected them, but because the earth had become too hot or too dry for them to live. These aren't metaphors. They're recollections of droughts so intense that entire communities were forced to migrate or reinvent their way of life. Volcanic eruptions played a role in some of these disasters, and geological evidence supports that. But even then, the timing feels tangled, as though multiple kinds of upheaval occurred close together, leaving people uncertain which event began the cascade. When the world delivers one shock after another, Myths blur them into a single narrative. A flood that follows a series of fires becomes part of one story, not two. A famine that arrives after a period of strange weather becomes linked to whatever celestial signs were remembered from that same era. It's in this overlapping of events that timelines become difficult to untangle. Civilizations experience catastrophes that didn't follow the patterns they relied on, and the unexpectedness of it all created a sense of collapse, deeper than the physical damage. When historians try to piece together the timelines of these ancient disasters, they find layers of evidence that don't always align neatly. Some events appear to have happened earlier or later than expected based on local records. Others seem to recur across several regions within similar spans of time, even when the cultures themselves had no contact with one another. This is where the idea of a passing world enters the conversation again, not as a certainty but as a possibility. A slight gravitational pull from an unfamiliar celestial object could alter sea levels temporarily, shift tectonic stress points, or disrupt atmospheric circulation. It wouldn't need to be a dramatic approach. The Earth is sensitive to balance, and a small change can magnify into large outcomes over time. If ocean tides increase subtly, river systems would feel the effects first. If wind patterns rotated differently, rainfall would fall where it wasn't needed and fail to fall where it was essential. If temperatures shifted beyond what seasonal cycles allowed, forests that had adapted to one rhythm would find themselves unprepared for another. These changes wouldn't all occur in the same year. They'd ripple outward through decades, appearing as anomalies at first, then as patterns. By the time communities realised something was deeply wrong, the origin point, the moment the sky changed, might have long faded back into memory. When civilizations collapsed or migrated in response to these long pulses of change, they didn't keep their reasoning strictly scientific. They wove their experiences into stories. It was the only vocabulary they had for something so immense. Floods became punishments or resets. Fires became battles between divine forces. Droughts became trials. Storms became warnings. These weren't mistakes. They were interpretations. When the earth trembles, people look for meaning, and meaning often takes the shape of narrative. Look at the Akkadian Empire. Its sudden decline has been studied for generations, and climate evidence reveals a period of extraordinary dryness, so severe that once fertile lands transformed into dust. Crops failed for multiple years, cities were abandoned, populations scattered. The region never fully returned to its former strength. Clay tablets from that era describe winds so thick with dust that the sun was veiled. They describe food shortages so severe that even the wealthy suffered. These aren't embellished tales, they're records of desperation. Yet they also describe omens in the sky, lights that preceded the crisis, unusual movements among the stars. In the Indus Valley, the decline of the once thriving Harappan cities followed patterns of shifting rivers, drying plains, and regional instability. Their downfall wasn't sudden, but it was significant. Some settlements adapted, others faded entirely. Later stories from nearby regions mention times when the sky signalled the coming of hardship. They might be symbolic references, but they suggest that people connected environmental changes with celestial disturbances. In Egypt, the end of the Old Kingdom corresponds with several decades of low Nile floods, famine, and political fragmentation. Inscriptions from that time reference periods when the land felt cursed, when the gods seemed distant, when life operated outside its usual rhythm. While these records don't mention strange celestial events directly, newer analyses of nearby cultures from the same era show that unusual sky phenomena were documented in surrounding regions. A single event could ripple through climates and societies across thousands of miles. None of this proves that a passing world caused these catastrophes. It simply reveals how fragile ancient stability was, how deeply environmental patterns shape civilizations, and how quickly those civilizations responded to change by encoding their fears and observations into stories that outlived them. Then there is the strange problem of timelines that refuse to behave. Myths describing enormous floods appear in cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Geological records show evidence of coastal inundation, glacial lake outbursts, and sea level rises occurring at various points in history. These events sometimes overlap, and sometimes seem out of sequence depending on how one interprets the evidence. Some catastrophes appear earlier in one region's storytelling than in its geological layers, or later in neighbouring regions that had less access to long-term writing. The timelines don't contradict each other, they simply refuse to settle neatly into one narrative. This type of misalignment is exactly what one might expect from a global system responding to a complex trigger. If Earth's climate shifted because of small gravitational nudges or altered solar input caused by disturbance in orbital dynamics, different regions would feel the effects at different times. Ice sheets might melt in one hemisphere earlier than storms form in another. Rivers might respond years before coastlines do. And human stories would reflect those regional differences. People record what they see first, then try to reconcile the rest later. Those reconciliations often stretch across generations, leaving myths with time frames that seem contradictory until the underlying event is understood. Flood legends often share the same ingredients even when separated by vast distances: torrential rain, rising seas, surviving heroes, a sense that the world before the flood was fundamentally different from the world afterward. One interpretation is that these stories are independent attempts to explain local disasters. Another is that some of these disasters were linked through climatic shifts that radiated outward from a single underlying cause. Something subtle, something external, something that didn't need to come dangerously close, but just close enough. Fires have similar ambiguities. Charcoal deposits found in certain layers around the world show moments when widespread burning occurred, not necessarily linked to human action. These periods correspond with evidence of sudden warming or atmospheric changes. They also correspond with times when many cultures describe celestial disturbances. Ancient chroniclers weren't tracking carbon levels or measuring temperatures. They were observing the world around them, trying to capture something that felt larger than local weather. If the land caught fire, they would look upward to find the reason. The memory of catastrophe doesn't fade quickly. It becomes a story told to children to warn them about the fragility of life. It becomes a ritual repeated yearly to honour survival. It becomes a myth written into tablets or carved into stone when the culture eventually acquires writing. And even after the memory becomes symbolic, the emotional weight remains. A flood that destroyed a region becomes a flood that reshaped the world. A fire that burned a forest becomes a fire that punished an entire age. A drought that drove communities apart becomes a divine cleansing. Stories expand to match the scale of fear. Yet beneath the expanded narrative lies a kernel of lived truth. Timelines that refuse to align neatly remind us that human memory doesn't follow strict chronology. It collects pieces of experience the way the ocean collects driftwood, carrying it across great distances before depositing it somewhere unexpected. A myth from one region might preserve details of an event that occurred thousands of years earlier in another region. Oral traditions can hold fragments of environmental memory for astonishing lengths of time, changing shape as they pass from one generation to the next, but preserving the emotional impact with surprising clarity. When modern researchers compare timelines across different cultures, they find moments when multiple regions appear to have remembered similar disturbances. Not identical, but parallel. Floods in one area, fires in another, strange weather in a third, lights in the sky in a fourth. When these accounts overlap in approximate eras, questions arise. Are these coincidences, or are these threads of memory tied to a larger shared experience? This is where the idea of a passing world becomes intriguing, not as an explanation that replaces all others, but as a possibility that could contribute to the complexity of the Earth's historical changes. If the orbit of a wandering planet brought it nearer to Earth in the distant past, Its presence might have amplified natural cycles already underway. It could have nudged climatic patterns into extremes that humans were not prepared to navigate. It could have interacted with Earth's systems in a way subtle enough not to leave direct physical scars, yet powerful enough to shift environmental rhythms, and those shifts, stretched across decades or centuries, would have produced the kinds of memories that endure in story form long after empirical details are lost. People living through these upheavals wouldn't have understood the mechanics. They wouldn't have measured gravitational fields or modelled atmospheric dynamics. They would have remembered the consequences. Water where it wasn't supposed to be. Fields turning barren. Forests falling silent. The world they knew rearranging itself slowly but undeniably. And when they asked why, their eyes lifted toward the heavens, toward the bright wanderer or unfamiliar light that appeared around the time the changes began. As this quiet journey continues, the next part moves into the long arc of how climbing and falling civilizations reshape themselves in response to these disruptions, and how memory, myth, and survival intertwined as people searched for meaning in a world whose rhythm had been unexpectedly altered. Across the long stretch of human history, whenever the world presented a mystery too large to ignore, people turned to two groups for guidance. One group watched the sky with patient, relentless focus, mapping every motion they could see and trying to hold the heavens still long enough to understand them. The other gathered around fires or in market squares, crafting narratives from the fragments of memory and observation that filtered through generations. Astronomers and storytellers, two traditions often thought of as opposites, yet in the deep past they were more intertwined than we realize. Both sought to explain a world that could be as steady as a sunbeam one year and as unpredictable as a storm the next. And few mysteries challenged them as much as the idea of a celestial wanderer that appeared without warning, disappeared too quickly, and returned only after ages had passed. Ancient astronomers were not simply curious observers, they held positions of great responsibility. The rise and fall of empires often hinged on their interpretations of the sky. When a strange object appeared, something that moved differently from the planets they understood, they documented it with a seriousness that echoed through the tablets and inscriptions they left behind. Their notes were precise, but often layered with meanings we no longer grasp. They didn't separate the physical from the symbolic because to them, the universe didn't separate those things either. A wandering object in the sky could be both a measurable body and a sign of impending change. Some of the earliest surviving astronomical records from Babylon describe moments when the heavens did not behave as expected. These texts are not dramatic, they're brief, structured, and meticulous. Yet within their calm descriptions lies a subtle tension. When a scribe recorded that a rare star lingered in the east longer than any known planet should, he was not writing poetry. He was noting a disruption. Something appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time was not simply interesting, it was unsettling. These scribes spent their lives tracing the predictable paths of celestial bodies. They memorized cycles lasting years or decades. They cross-referenced observations with those of their predecessors. So when they noted an object whose movement didn't fit any known cycle, the implication was profound. Something had arrived that didn't belong in the familiar order of the sky. From these records, later cultures inherited the idea of a world that came and went without warning. A world whose orbit was too long, too strange, or too distant to be charted by consistent human observation. A world that might vanish for centuries, only to reappear suddenly and change the course of events. This concept lingered long after the original observers had turned to dust. Not because everyone believed in a literal wandering planet, but because the stories offered a way to understand the unpredictable. Where astronomers recorded positions and movements, storytellers filled in the gaps of meaning. They took the faint outline of an object that shouldn't exist and gave it shape. They explained why it came. They imagined where it went. They described its influence on floods, fires, leaders, and destinies. Their stories travelled faster than any tablet or chart, spreading not only through time but across cultures, and as they travelled, they gained new layers, adjusting to the fears and hopes of each community that adopted them. These two ways of knowing, empirical observation and narrative meaning, often reinforced one another. When astronomers noted a strange object, storytellers translated that tension into myth. When storytellers preserved the myth, later astronomers sought physical explanations for it. Over time, the idea of a world that comes and goes became part of a shared cultural memory, even among people who never knew the original observations. The puzzle that emerges from this interplay is complex. It's not simply a question of whether a wandering world existed. It's a question of how human cultures interpreted rare celestial events, and why the idea refused to disappear. Even when science advanced and instruments improved, the fascination with a returning world persisted. This persistence suggests that something in the human mind resonates deeply with the idea of cycles too long for a single lifetime. Something in us recognizes the possibility of patterns that outlast entire civilizations. Consider the astronomers of ancient China, who kept some of the most detailed sky records in history. They documented sudden stars, slow-moving lights, and unusual celestial visitors with extraordinary precision. Their records include sightings that remain unexplained even now, objects bright enough to cast shadows or visible long enough to rule out meteors. Some were novas or comets. Others remain uncertain. Yet Chinese storytellers developed parallel traditions in which celestial visitors signaled transitions in dynasties or shifts in the cosmic order. These stories weren't invented to entertain. They were tools to interpret the emotional and political weight of strange phenomena. When the sky changed, the empire changed. And when something unpredictable appeared, people needed narratives to navigate the uncertainty. In the Mediterranean world, early Greek astronomers encountered their own puzzles. As their mathematical models of the heavens became more refined, they identified inconsistencies that suggested unseen influences. They debated whether additional planets might exist beyond those visible to the eye. They speculated about counter-Earths or hidden bodies travelling in elongated paths. These were not confirmations of a wandering world, but they show that the concept of unseen planetary forces was not foreign to early scientific thought. And alongside these discussions, Greek storytellers spun myths about celestial visitors, gods descending in flaming chariots, and stars that heralded dramatic shifts in human affairs. While the tone was different from the practical Babylonian approach, the pattern remained. The sky offered the unknown, story offered understanding. Farther south, Egyptian priests interpreted the heavens through a lens of divine order. Their astronomical observations were exceptionally consistent, yet even they occasionally recorded phenomena that didn't match the established cycles of their gods. Their stories spoke of stars that appeared during times of upheaval, symbols of transition or rebirth, sometimes frightening, sometimes oddly hopeful. These narratives were woven into their temples, their rituals, and their sense of cosmic balance. A world that appeared and disappeared without pattern would have fit naturally into their understanding of time as a series of cycles anchored to celestial behaviour. In Mesoamerica, the traditions were different but resonated with similar themes. The Maya tracked Venus with breathtaking accuracy, noting every deviation in its movement. When something unusual appeared, they incorporated it into their layered cosmology. Their codices include accounts of brilliant objects that moved across the sky in ways that defied easy categorization. These objects were interpreted through the lens of cycles, destruction, and renewal. Their stories preserved emotional truths even when physical details blurred across generations. What ties these varied traditions together is not proof of a single celestial event, but a shared sensitivity to the irregular. Humans notice what doesn't fit the pattern. When something extraordinary appears in the sky, people try to understand it with whatever tools they have. Astronomers use charts and mathematics. Storytellers use metaphor and narrative. The result is a layered memory that persists long after the event itself becomes unclear. In many cultures, stories about a wandering world became symbolic rather than literal. a planet that comes and goes could represent eras of transition. The arrival of a bright object might symbolize the collapse of one age and the beginning of another. Yet in some traditions, the literal and symbolic remained intertwined. People believed the world experienced physical disturbances connected to celestial appearances, and they preserved that belief with surprising consistency. As centuries passed and scientific understanding grew, astronomers continued to encounter puzzles that echoed the ancient idea of a missing or intermittent world. The discovery of Neptune was prompted by irregularities in the orbit of Uranus, suggesting the presence of an unseen planet. When Neptune was found, astronomers noticed additional irregularities, prompting a search that led to the discovery of Pluto. Later, Pluto proved too small to account for the remaining discrepancies. New hypotheses arose. Perhaps another planet existed in the outer solar system. Perhaps its orbit was too long or too distant for easy detection. The idea was speculative but grounded in observation, echoing the ancient search for something that didn't fit the expected pattern. Modern astronomers propose the existence of a hypothetical Planet 9 based on the unusual clustering of certain distant objects in the Kuiper belt. If such a planet exists, its orbit could take tens of thousands of years to complete. It would remain unseen for nearly all of human history, only approaching visibility at rare intervals. Not close enough to pose danger, but close enough that early observers might have perceived it under the right conditions. Not luminous on its own, but reflective enough to appear in the dark if sunlight caught it at a favourable angle. This is not confirmation of any ancient story, yet it demonstrates something striking. The solar system may indeed contain bodies that come and go on timescales far beyond the lifespan of civilizations. A wandering world is not a fantasy. It's a possibility we have only recently begun to investigate seriously. The storyteller's version of a returning world is less concerned with orbital mechanics and more concerned with meaning. A world that returns symbolizes the cycles of history, the rise and fall of empires, the fragility of human life against cosmic scales. It represents the idea that the universe has its own rhythm and that humanity is just one small part of it. Even now, modern retellings of ancient myths, whether in fiction, documentaries, or speculative theories, tap into that same emotional core. We may no longer view the sky as a place of divine messages, but we still look to it for perspective. The puzzle of a planet that comes and goes endures because it sits at the crossroads of two ways of understanding reality. Scientists search for patterns, storytellers search for meaning. When those two searches converge, the result is a narrative that refuses to fade. Not because people cling to superstition, but because the mystery taps into something universal. The sense that the world may be shaped by forces larger than we can easily comprehend. The recognition that the sky, despite all we have learned, still holds secrets. Astronomers record movements that sometimes appear irregular. Storytellers preserve memories of disruption. Historians attempt to reconcile fragmented timelines. Mythologists trace overlapping themes. Geologists uncover evidence of abrupt environmental changes. Each field sees part of the picture. No single discipline can explain everything, but together they reveal a tapestry of both observation and interpretation stretching across millennia. A wandering world, real or metaphorical, became a bridge between what people saw and what they felt. When the world changed suddenly, the heavens offered a framework for understanding. When the heavens changed, people looked to their stories to make sense of it. The puzzle persists because neither astronomy nor storytelling can fully resolve it on their own. It asks for both precision and imagination. It invites questions about the nature of memory, the shape of history, and the limits of human knowledge. As the path continues, the next part leads into the deeper consequences of this interplay, where people built cities and cultures under the shadow of a sky they trusted until they suddenly didn't. A story of how entire societies grew in the presence of a world that may or may not have returned, and how their rise or fall became entangled with the fear and fascination stirred by a visitor whose timing no one could predict. When people imagine a wandering world drifting near Earth, The mind often leaps immediately to destruction, as if proximity alone guarantees catastrophe. Yet the science of celestial encounters is more nuanced, more restrained, and in a strange way more unsettling because of that restraint. The solar system is an intricate dance of masses and distances, gravities interwoven in patterns that hold everything from dust grains to gas giants in predictable orbits. But patterns, even the most stable ones, can be influenced by visitors. A passing giant doesn't need to collide with Earth to change history. It doesn't need to tear oceans from their basins or shatter mountains. It can alter the world in quieter ways, subtle enough that the effects unfold slowly, yet powerful enough that later civilizations feel the consequences without ever knowing the cause. To understand what a stray giant might do, it helps to picture how sensitive Earth is. The planet doesn't appear fragile at first glance. It has endured impacts, volcanic eras, ice ages, and warming cycles. But beneath its resilience lies a delicate balance. The tilt of its axis determines seasons. The shape of its orbit influences long-term climate rhythms. The moon controls tides, polishes Earth's wobble, and helps stabilize life-friendly cycles. Alter any of these with even a small external nudge, and the results spread across generations. A passing world, depending on its size, speed and distance, could exert a gravitational pull strong enough to alter these balances, while remaining far enough away to leave no visible mark. That's one of the easiest misunderstandings about cosmic forces. Gravitational influence doesn't require close proximity. It only requires enough mass and movement. Even Jupiter, sitting hundreds of millions of miles away, shapes the asteroid belt and protects Earth from countless potential impacts. A world drifting nearer than Jupiter, yet still millions of kilometers distant, could influence tides, seasons, or orbital eccentricity, even if it never approached dangerously. The first and most immediate effect would be gravitational tides, not the familiar ocean tides created by the moon, but Earth tides, atmospheric tides, and mantle tides. Gravity pulls on everything, not just water. If a wandering planet approached within a resonant distance, the Earth itself could flex slightly in response. The crust might rise or fall by centimetres or more, depending on the magnitude of the pull. Under normal circumstances, these movements would be subtle, imperceptible to the people living through them. Over time, though, they could strain fault lines, increase the likelihood of earthquakes, or amplify volcanic activity in regions already poised for eruption. Ancient records describing periods of intensified seismic activity might reflect this type of influence. Those records rarely contain the language of physics. Instead, they describe the Earth groaning, mountains breathing fire, or the ground trembling beneath people's feet with unnerving persistence. Civilizations often attributed these disruptions to gods or spirits, but they might just as easily reflect a planetary system responding to an external force. Atmospheric changes could unfold even more subtly. A passing giant would tug on Earth's atmosphere, just as it would on the crust and oceans. These shifts wouldn't rip the air from the sky or create immediate storms. Instead, they might alter temperature gradients or jet stream patterns, slowing down established atmospheric cycles and encouraging others to accelerate. Regions accustomed to predictable weather might experience prolonged droughts or seasons of unusually intense rainfall. Crops would fail in some places and flourish unexpectedly in others. Trade networks would shift as communities sought new resources. Myths would arise to explain why the world no longer behaved as it used to. The oceans would feel the pull in their own way. The moon's gravitational influence creates the tides we know, but a passing world could stretch these patterns, creating higher highs and lower lows for a time. Even a slight increase in tidal intensity would reshape coastlines, erode river mouths, or push saltwater farther inland. Communities built along deltas might see farmland damaged by intrusion of brackish water. Fishermen might note new currents or unusual behaviour in marine life. Sailors might report swells that didn't align with the wind or weather. and if the passing object lingered on the horizon for weeks or months, people would naturally connect the celestial visitor with the changes they saw in the water. Earth's axis could also shift, though only slightly. Our planet tilts at about 23.5 degrees, and that tilt creates the seasons. If a stray giant exerted even a mild pull, the tilt could wobble or adjust by a fraction of a degree. It doesn't take much to influence climate. A shift of less than a degree could change the boundaries of monsoon systems, expand one climate zone while shrinking another, or alter the freeze-thaw patterns that govern river life. Changes like these wouldn't make headlines in a modern world packed with satellites and data models, but in an ancient world without instruments, the consequences would feel mysterious, almost supernatural. Imagine a community that relied on yearly floods to nourish its fields. If those floods suddenly failed to arrive, or arrived too late, or came too violently, the people living there would scramble for explanations. They would watch the sky. They would note any unusual object overhead. They would look for patterns that might reveal why the river no longer followed its ancient rhythm. They might blame the heavens because the heavens were the most visible source of change. And if a wandering world passed overhead during that time, even distantly, the association would become a story. Even a small perturbation of Earth's orbit could produce long-term effects. Earth's path around the Sun is not a perfect circle. It stretches slightly into an ellipse, and this shape shifts over tens of thousands of years through natural cycles known as Milankovitch cycles. These cycles influence ice ages, warming periods, and global climate patterns. A passing planet might nudge Earth into a slightly different orbital eccentricity, altering the long-term climate rhythm. The change wouldn't be noticeable immediately. It would reveal itself slowly, perhaps over generations, as seasons drifted subtly or climatic extremes became more pronounced. People living at the beginning of the shift might simply note unusual storms or colder winters. Their grandchildren might call those changes the new normal. Their descendants might tell stories about a time when the world felt different, anchored to memories of a strange object in the sky. Then there's the magnetosphere, Earth's protective magnetic shield. A massive passing object with its own magnetic field could disturb Earth's field temporarily. This disturbance might not flip the poles or tear apart the shield. Instead, it could create periods of intensified auroras, shifts in radiation exposure, or temporary disruptions in atmospheric chemistry. Ancient observers might describe unusual colours in the sky, nights that glowed brighter than expected, or strange animal behaviour during these moments. They might see these glowing displays as signs of divine attention or cosmic upheaval. One of the most interesting scientific possibilities involves resonance. If the passing world moved in a way that matched natural resonant frequencies within Earth systems, the effects could amplify significantly. Ocean basins have resonance patterns just like musical instruments. The atmosphere has them as well. Even Earth's crust vibrates in response to daily and seasonal cycles. A gravitational influence that aligned with these frequencies, even slightly, could magnify certain natural events. Storms could intensify. Tides could grow more dramatic. Volcanic activity could cluster in unusual ways. These amplified effects wouldn't need to last long. A few years or decades of heightened activity would be enough to imprint themselves on human memory. Ancient civilizations didn't have the scientific vocabulary for resonance or orbital perturbation. They understood the world through cycles, seasons, and omens. When the cycles faltered, they looked for causes. And when the cause appeared in the sky, glowing or moving or lingering in ways that defied the predictable, that cause became a story. This interplay between observation and interpretation shaped cultures across continents. A comet might pass and cause no measurable effect, yet become a symbol of upheaval simply because its appearance coincided with unrest. Conversely, a distant planetary visitor might create real gravitational changes while being too faint for most people to see directly. Its influence would manifest through climate, tides, and migration patterns rather than through spectacle. People would search for explanations when their world changed, and they would latch onto any sign that seemed to match the scale of their fear. This raises a curious possibility. What if some civilizations witnessed the passing object clearly, while others saw only the consequences? A planet on an eccentric orbit might be visible from certain latitudes, but not others, depending on its angle relative to Earth's horizon. Northern cultures might record a bright wanderer overhead, while southern cultures experienced only the climatic aftermath. This would explain why the stories are uneven, why some regions have vivid descriptions while others rely on indirect accounts. It would also explain why the memory of such an event remains fragmented, scattered like pieces of pottery across time. There's another dimension to this puzzle: orbital mechanics. A world on a long stretched orbit would accelerate as it fell inward toward the sun, moving more quickly through the inner solar system. Its appearance might be sudden, its departure just as swift. The entire encounter could unfold in a few months or years, not long enough for a civilization to fully understand what was happening. People would note the object, feel the consequences, and watch it fade before they had time to create consistent records. Most of the evidence would be experiential rather than textual. Only fragments would remain. Modern astronomy acknowledges that wandering planets exist throughout the galaxy. We have detected rogue worlds not bound to any star, drifting freely. We have found exoplanets with elongated orbits that swing close to their suns every few centuries. We've observed stellar systems where giant planets influence smaller bodies from great distances. None of this proves that Earth experienced something similar, but it demonstrates that the idea is consistent with what we know about planetary dynamics. A passing giant could also interact indirectly with Earth by disturbing the outer solar system. The Kuiper Belt, a region of icy bodies beyond Neptune, is sensitive to gravitational influences. If a wandering planet perturbed these objects, it might send comets inward over centuries. Some of those comets could strike Earth. Others could graze the atmosphere or burn brightly in the sky. Cultures with strong astronomical traditions would record these events with deep significance. Over generations, a series of celestial disturbances might be compressed into a single myth, or interpreted as the return of the same visitor. Even after the passing world moved on, the gravitational echoes could linger. Earth's climate might settle into a new rhythm. Ocean circulation patterns might shift. Monsoon cycles might alter. Animals would adapt. Humans would migrate. Civilizations would reorganize. These long-term patterns wouldn't feel like the consequence of a single event. They would feel like a slow evolution. Yet they could originate from one moment of cosmic influence. A moment when a world brushed past ours like a shadow and left subtle fingerprints everywhere. The science of close encounters is full of what-ifs and maybes, not because evidence is lacking, but because the effects are often subtle rather than spectacular. A dramatic collision leaves craters and extinction patterns. A near encounter leaves puzzles. It reshapes the world quietly, leaving future generations to sift through the clues. Archaeology, geology, mythology, and astronomy each hold pieces of the puzzle, but no single field can solve it alone. What makes the idea so compelling isn't just the scientific feasibility, it's the way this possibility blends naturally with the stories ancient people told. Science offers the mechanics, story offers the memory. Neither is complete without the other, and somewhere in the intersection between equations and myths lies the image of a world that came close, nudged the Earth ever so slightly, and then faded back into the dark, leaving behind a cascade of climate shifts, tidal anomalies, and cultural upheavals that later generations would try to explain as best they could. As this quiet journey continues, the next part moves from the science of influence to the people who lived beneath those shifts, into the ways civilizations rose, fell, and rebuilt themselves in the long shadow of changes they didn't understand, guided only by the stories they told to make sense of a sky that had once behaved differently. History tends to look solid when written in books, Timelines appear clean, civilizations rise and fall in neat arcs, and change seems orderly from a distance. Yet when you step closer to the ancient world, the edges blur. Entire cultures shift position as if pushed by an unseen hand. Cities hollow out. New ones bloom. Trade routes bend and twist. Languages scatter like seeds across distant landscapes. Something moves people, and the reasons behind those movements rarely fit into a single story. Wars explain some, droughts explain others. But underneath the surface there are periods when migrations and collapses appear across continents within narrow spans of time, suggesting that more than local struggles or isolated misfortunes were at work. Something larger may have nudged humanity across the face of the earth. For early civilizations, the sky was both clock and compass. When it behaved differently, people felt the shift long before they knew how to articulate it. They didn't think in terms of orbital mechanics or atmospheric cycles. They thought in terms of harvests that arrived out of sync, rivers that no longer obeyed their seasonal rhythms, rains that fell too heavily or not at all, stars that appeared in unfamiliar places, and omens that spread unease through entire communities. When these disruptions lasted long enough, people moved. Not because they wanted to, but because everything that tied them to the land, food, water, stability, meaning, had loosened. One of the earliest examples appears in the ancient Near East, where the Akkadian Empire, once powerful enough to connect vast swathes of Mesopotamia, suddenly sank into decline. Archaeological layers from that time show widespread drought, intensifying over decades. Crops failed repeatedly, settlements shrank, nomadic groups pushed into struggling regions in search of pasture. The collapse wasn't a slow exhalation of an aging empire, it was abrupt. Something shifted in the climate and the empire fractured in response. Clay tablets from that era don't describe natural cycles failing on their own. They describe omens, strange winds, and a sky that no longer behaved. Whether or not a celestial visitor played a role, people perceived the heavens as active participants in the collapse. Not far away, in the Indus Valley, cities that had thrived for centuries began to thin out. The once ordered grid of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro loosened. Wells fell into disuse. Trade diminished. By the time the decline reached its final stages, urban centres had transitioned into smaller settlements scattered across the landscape. Climate evidence suggests that rivers changed course and monsoons weakened. The people living there would have felt the shift as a slow tightening around their lives. The sky didn't need to erupt for them to sense something was different. It only needed to tilt the balance slightly, altering rainfall patterns or lengthening dry seasons. When the rains stopped fulfilling their predictable promise, people moved eastward and northward, following water and opportunity. Across the Mediterranean, civilizations shaped by the sea encountered their own transformations. The Late Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most puzzling events in ancient history. Within a relatively brief span, major powers, Mycenae, the Hittites, the city-states along the Levantine coast, fell apart. Palaces burned, trade networks dissolved, populations dispersed. No single cause explains the collapse. Instead, a cluster of disruptions appears in the archaeological record. Droughts, earthquakes, famine, sudden migrations, and political upheaval. Ancient inscriptions describe invaders arriving from the sea, but these invaders may have been displaced people themselves, moving because their own lands could no longer support them. When the heavens shift the climate just enough, migrations become waves. Even far from the centres of empire, societies experience their own abrupt changes. In prehistoric North America, population movements occurred in cycles tied loosely to climate oscillations. Periods of warmth allowed communities to expand northward. Cooling periods forced them south again. Archaeological evidence shows shifts in settlement patterns aligned with environmental changes that would have been invisible in the moment yet overwhelming over decades. The people who moved did so without understanding the complex interplay of global systems. They knew only that the land no longer supported them as it once had. A migrating world, even at a great distance, might have intensified these cycles. If a stray giant altered Earth's tilt slightly, or nudged atmospheric circulation into a new pattern, regions accustomed to consistency could be thrown into chaos. A monsoon arriving 2 months late or a winter arriving 2 weeks early could devastate early agricultural societies. People depended on predictability. When predictability vanished, they dispersed in search of stability. These migrations weren't always desperate. Sometimes they opened new possibilities. A sudden shift in climate could weaken one society while strengthening another. When heavy rains returned to Egypt after previous periods of dryness, the land flourished, enabling the rise of centralized kingdoms. In China, changes in the Yellow River's behavior pushed populations into fertile plains that became the cradle of new dynastic eras. In Mesoamerica, shifting rainfall patterns encouraged the growth of early agricultural communities that later blossomed into advanced cultures. Golden ages, when they appeared, often emerged after periods of disruption. New political structures formed, innovations spread, art and writing flourished. It was as if the world, after shaking itself loose from an old pattern, settled temporarily into a new one with renewed energy. These golden ages weren't uniform, but they shared a pattern. Stability emerging from the aftermath of instability, a cycle of collapse followed by renewal. This rhythm appears across civilizations. The Middle Kingdom of Egypt rose after the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, bringing prosperity and artistic refinement. The Greek classical era followed a dark age during which population shrank and writing nearly disappeared. The Persian Empire emerged from a region previously fragmented by conflict. The Maya experienced cycles of rise, decline, and resurgence. Even the Roman Empire grew out of a patchwork of peoples shaped by earlier migrations. When the heavens moved people, the effects weren't uniform. Some regions suffered, others benefited. Some societies were scattered, others consolidated. The world reorganized itself repeatedly, with each shift creating new opportunities and new vulnerabilities. If a wandering world contributed to these cycles, even lightly, the influence would have been indirect rather than dramatic. A tilt adjustment here, a shift in atmospheric flow there, a change in ocean temperature patterns that took decades to reveal its full impact. Ancient people wouldn't have connected these shifts through a scientific lens. They would have attributed the changes to the gods, to fate, to celestial events too large to ignore. Records from China speak of dynasties falling after the appearance of troubling stars. Mesopotamian texts describe rulers seeking guidance when a bright object lingered in the sky. Mesoamerican myths frame celestial disturbances as thresholds between ages. Stories preserve these emotional truths even when physical details blurred. People remembered that something changed. They remembered the ground feeling less stable, the rivers less reliable, the seasons less comforting. And they remembered looking up and seeing something unfamiliar. The migrations that followed were rarely linear. People didn't move in one direction. They branched outward, splitting into groups, reconnecting centuries later, forming networks that shaped the development of language, culture, and identity. Indo-European expansions, Bantu migrations, Polynesian voyages across the Pacific, all of these were influenced by patterns of climate, opportunity, and necessity. Even small shifts in the world's climate could alter the paths these migrations took. Consider how wind patterns influence Polynesian navigation. Favourable winds opened routes, unfavourable ones closed them. If atmospheric circulation changed for even a decade, entire exploration windows could open or close. A passing world, tugging slightly on Earth's systems, could have reshaped these opportunities in ways that left no direct trace other than the routes people ultimately chose. The collapse of some civilizations also created space for others. After the Bronze Age kingdoms fell, new cultures rose in their place. The Phoenicians expanded maritime trade. Small Greek communities reorganized and later flourished. The kingdom of Judah emerged amid the ruins of earlier regional powers. If celestial disturbances influenced the collapse, they also indirectly influenced the rise. These transitions weren't always marked by sudden violence. Sometimes they unfolded through slow movement, families shifting their homes year after year, fields becoming harder to cultivate, opportunities appearing farther away. This gradual migration is harder to see in archaeology, yet it shaped human history as deeply as any battle. Even golden ages carry shadows of earlier catastrophes. Prosperity often arrives because previous instability forced innovation. People experiment when the familiar world fails them. They adapt technologies, reconsider political systems, and restructure their societies. The brilliance of a golden age is frequently rooted in the hardships that came before. Ancient stories reflect this dynamic. Myths describe ages of chaos followed by ages of order. Egyptian tradition speaks of a time when the land was in turmoil before a divine ruler restored harmony. Greek mythology divides time into ages, each shaped by celestial and earthly forces. Mesoamerican traditions describe cycles of suns, with each age ending and beginning anew. These stories aren't just metaphors for natural cycles. They preserve the emotional memory of times when the heavens seemed to lean closer. A passing world didn't need to announce itself loudly for people to connect their struggles to its presence. A glowing object on the horizon, visible for a season, paired with changes in weather or earth movements, would have been enough. People living through these shifts didn't require scientific proof. They needed meaning, and stories filled that need. Those stories followed them as they migrated. They carried tales of floods and fires, of omens and visitors, of dangers and blessings. As groups separated, their versions diverged, but the core idea remained. Something had changed the world. Something had moved them, and that something had come from the sky. Later generations inherited the consequences without knowing the cause. They built cities where earlier migrants had settled. They established traditions rooted in old fears and hopes. They carved myths into stone walls, painted them in temples, or passed them through oral poetry. These myths became part of the structure of their civilizations, shaping identity long after the original events had faded into the distance. As more time passed, migrations became history, collapses became legend, and golden ages became benchmarks against which future generations measured themselves. The sky remained the common thread. It offered both explanation and inspiration. Even now, when satellites and observatories have expanded our understanding of the universe, the ancient impulse to look upward during times of instability remains. Humans still feel the pull of the heavens when the world shifts. As this quiet path continues, the next part moves toward the beings who populated those ancient stories, visitors, teachers, messengers, or reflections of human imagination, and how the myths surrounding them grew from the chaos and renewal that unfolded beneath a sky that once behaved differently. When ancient civilizations remembered the moments when their world shifted, they didn't limit themselves to describing what they saw. They described who arrived. Their records, etched in clay, carved in stone, woven into stories that endured longer than the walls of their cities, speak of figures who appeared during times of upheaval, times when floods surged, lands dried, winds sharpened, or the sky glowed in unfamiliar colours. These weren't ordinary visitors. They were beings who stepped out of storms, walked from mountains, descended from the heavens, or emerged from the sea carrying symbols of power. They taught, they warned, they commanded, they comforted. And in nearly every culture where these stories survive, these beings are remembered as gods or as messengers of forces too vast to comprehend. Myths that speak of visitors arriving in the dust are not isolated curiosities. They appear in regions separated by oceans, languages, and eras. The details differ, yet the rhythm of the narrative remains strangely consistent. Something changed in the world. People suffered or struggled. a figure emerged who possessed knowledge beyond that of ordinary humans. That figure guided, rebuilt, corrected, or stood as a reminder that the turmoil unfolding around them was part of a cycle larger than anyone could see. This narrative pattern becomes even more striking when placed alongside periods of environmental disruption and migration. When the land cracked from drought or the rivers rose unpredictably, communities reshaped themselves. They left old settlements behind. They encountered new landscapes. They merged with other groups or broke apart. And in these moments of transition, stories formed to explain why fate had shifted so suddenly. Stories need catalysts, forces that initiate change. Sometimes those catalysts took the shape of celestial events. Other times they took the form of gods arriving during upheaval. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest such figures appears in stories of a sage emerging after a great flood, this being brought with him the knowledge needed to rebuild society. He was not a human in the ordinary sense. He had the appearance of someone who came from elsewhere, a figure straddling the boundary between mortal and divine. The flood itself may reflect memories of real inundations that reshape the region, but the presence of a visitor in its aftermath suggests that people sought a reassuring narrative to explain why life could begin again after such devastation. In Central America, a tall, pale figure appears in stories of upheaval and reconstruction. He arrives when societies face disorder. He teaches agriculture, mathematics, and the calendar. He leaves when stability returns. His name changes across cultures, but the arc of the story remains. A visitor appears when needed, offers knowledge, and vanishes as quietly as he came. These stories emerge during eras that coincide with archaeological evidence of disruptions. Volcanic eruptions, droughts, migrations, political fragmentation. When the world became unstable, the people who lived through it created narratives of beings who brought clarity in times of darkness. Egyptian stories contain another version. In times of chaos, a deity associated with wisdom and restoration appears to guide rulers. This presence is not always described in human form, yet the function is similar. A powerful figure arrives during a period of imbalance, stabilizes the world, and then retreats. Egyptian mythology rarely attributes catastrophe solely to human failures. Instead, disruptions in the land are framed as distortions in cosmic order. When cosmic order falters, a visitor, divine or semi-divine, returns to restore balance. Many cultures connected these visitors to the sky. Some descended from celestial boats. Some arrived on beams of light. Others emerged from stars that brightened unexpectedly. These details feel symbolic, yet they align with the emotional impact of celestial disturbances described in early astronomical records. When the heavens behaved strangely, people expected the world to change. And when the world changed, they expected the arrival of powerful beings. The pattern becomes sharper when connected to the possibility of a wandering world. If a passing object influenced Earth's climate or destabilized seasons, ancient people wouldn't have understood the mechanics. They would have felt the consequences. Floods too large, fires too widespread, migrations too sudden. And if a bright object lingered in the sky around the same time, it might have become the focal point of every story told afterward. The visitor in the sky became the visitor on Earth. What people couldn't explain with physics, they explained through mythology. Some myths even describe the arrival of beings during periods when the world seemed to tilt into a different rhythm. In Andean traditions, there are stories of figures emerging during an era when the land changed shape. They brought tools and knowledge. They taught people how to survive in mountain regions newly exposed by geological shifts. These stories may encode memories of climatic transitions in the Andes, glacial retreats, floods from melting ice, or volcanic activity that transform the landscape. The figure who appears is remembered as a civilizer, a restorer, someone bridging the gap between old and new worlds. In Polynesia, stories recall visitors who emerged during times when the sea behaved unpredictably. The ocean rose or fell in ways that puzzled navigators. Storms arrived in unusual patterns. These conditions likely reflect ancient climate events that altered sea levels and wind directions. The myths speak of beings arriving in canoes not built by human hands, teaching people how to navigate new waters. Whether those beings were symbolic or rooted in memories of distant travellers, the narrative reflects how people understood upheaval as a moment when the world itself attracted visitors. Even in the far reaches of northern Europe, stories speak of gods or wanderers arriving during long winters or summers of strange light. Some myths describe periods when the sun behaved unpredictably, something modern researchers have connected to solar cycles and volcanic eruptions. In these stories, a visitor appears, offering guidance or warnings until the world returns to its normal rhythm. What connects all of these traditions is the timing. The gods arrive during upheaval. They do not appear when everything is normal. They do not interrupt peaceful eras without reason. They emerge when the world is already shifting, when people are frightened or disoriented, when the environment challenges the continuity of life. The stories become a way to anchor memory, embedding meaning in chaos so that future generations can understand what happened. These visitors carry knowledge because knowledge is what people need most during crises. Floods erase farmlands, droughts force migrations, fires destroy tools and homes. In these moments, knowledge becomes sacred. Teaching becomes an act of salvation. So stories cast these visitors as bearers of wisdom, architects of new societies, givers of laws or skills that allow humanity to adapt to new conditions. Many myths describe them as returning after long intervals. They come when needed, leave when their work is done, and promise to appear again if the world enters another cycle of upheaval. This recurring motif reflects an understanding that the world moves through rhythms larger than human lifetimes. People recognized that climate, environment, and society could shift dramatically, and they needed narratives that framed those shifts as part of an understandable pattern. A visitor who returns periodically mirrors the possibility of a celestial event with a long orbit, something that disappears for generations, then reappears without warning. The connection between celestial objects and divine visitors becomes clearer in traditions where gods are associated directly with stars or planets. Mesopotamian texts describe gods embodied by wandering lights. Egyptian mythology links deities to specific celestial cycles. Mesoamerican traditions tie gods to the movement of Venus or other bright objects. If an unfamiliar object appeared during times of upheaval, it wouldn't have been difficult for ancient people to connect the arrival of a visitor in the sky with the arrival of a visitor on Earth. Even the way these stories describe the visitors matches the emotional reaction people experience during crises. The visitors are often calm when the world is troubled. They speak with authority when people feel lost. They bring structure to lives that have been upended. These traits reflect the human desire for guidance when the environment destabilizes. The stories survive because they answer a need that is as universal now as it was thousands of years ago. In some myths, the visitors are not benevolent. They appear as enforcers, destroyers, or judges during times of widespread suffering. They are remembered as figures who punish civilizations for hubris or neglect. These narratives appear in cultures that experience sudden collapses, harsh droughts, erupting volcanoes, invading armies, or natural disasters that shattered their societies. The figure who arrives becomes the embodiment of those forces, a face given to the chaos. People didn't want to believe that suffering could occur without purpose. They created visitors who made sense of the destruction. Yet even in these darker stories, the visitors depart. They don't remain indefinitely. Their presence is tied to the moment of transformation, and once the new order is established, they vanish. This cyclical pattern mirrors the way catastrophes unfold. They begin abruptly, alter everything, and then fade, leaving survivors to rebuild. The idea of a passing world fits into this narrative structure, not because ancient people understood planetary mechanics, but because they understood cycles of upheaval and renewal. A wandering world would not appear frequently. It would not linger indefinitely. It would arrive during an era that might coincide with climate shifts, tectonic activity, or societal collapse. People living through those shifts would connect their experiences to the celestial visitor. Their stories would preserve both the fear and the hope embedded in those years. When archaeologists examine the layers of ancient settlements, they often see periods of abrupt abandonment, followed by periods of vibrant growth. These cycles reflect the resilient pattern of collapse and renewal. The myths about visitors map onto these cycles with surprising consistency. A society collapses, a new one rises. The stories describe guidance from beings who arrived at the turning point. Modern scholars debate whether these visitors were metaphors, memory distortions, cultural exchanges, or symbolic reflections of nature's power. Yet the persistence of the theme across so many cultures suggests something deeper. Humans look for meaning during upheaval. They give form to forces they cannot see. They imagine visitors who can explain what they themselves cannot articulate. A wandering world passing distantly but visibly overhead would have been a perfect canvas for these narratives. Its presence would have signalled that something in the heavens had shifted. Its slow motion across the sky would have given people time to absorb the symbolism. Its disappearance would have matched the departure of the visitors described in their stories. As this calm journey continues, the next part moves toward the physical ground beneath those stories, into the soil and stone that hold the remnants of past ages, where clues, scientific, archaeological and interpretive, wait quietly for those willing to trace the connections between mythic visitors and the earth they seem to follow. When people look for stories of the past, they usually begin with the things that rise above the ground: broken temples, weathered carvings, scattered ruins that still cling to the outlines of what they once were. Yet what lies beneath the surface often speaks louder than the monuments left behind. Soil remembers what humans forget. It records floods that swallowed whole fields. It keeps traces of fires long cooled. It holds pollen from forests that no longer exist, sediment from rivers that changed course centuries ago, ash from volcanoes that terrified ancient skies, and layered within that record are signals that hint at moments when the world behaved differently, when societies rose or collapsed not just from their own choices, but from changes in the environment that seem to come from nowhere. The soil doesn't interpret these events, it simply keeps them. But when physicists, archaeologists, geologists, and storytellers work side by side, the ground becomes a kind of quiet narrator, offering clues about the rhythms of the past. These clues don't point to certainty, they point to patterns. Patterns that align eerily with the stories people told about gods arriving in dust, strange visitors crossing the heavens, and worlds shifting under forces too vast to comprehend. In parts of Mesopotamia, core samples reveal abrupt transitions from fertile soil to thick layers of silt deposited by unusually intense flooding. These layers don't represent seasonal inundations. They represent events that overwhelmed entire landscapes. For years afterward, the soil retains chemical signatures of stagnant water, decayed vegetation, and rapid sedimentation. The people who lived through these upheavals turned the experience into myth. The ground beneath them recorded the event in its own way, preserving the physical aftermath long after the story was shaped into something that felt more meaningful than mud and water. Farther east, in the Indus Valley, layers of soil reveal another pattern. Sediments show periods of sudden drought. Grains of ancient pollen disappear in certain layers, replaced by species adapted to dry, harsh conditions. Riverbeds show signs of abandonment, as though their waters shrank or vanished unexpectedly. Archaeological sites constructed with precision and care slowly lose their coherence as people left or restructured their communities. The soil tells a story of departure. The myths from nearby regions speak of visitors who guided migrations or taught new ways of living. Two kinds of memory, physical and narrative, unfolding side by side. In regions touched by the Bronze Age collapse, soil layers contain traces of multiple stressors, ash from fires that spread beyond normal patterns, signs of earthquakes captured in jagged breaks between sediment layers, deposits that suggest periods of intense erosion. These disruptions correlate with abandoned palaces, forgotten trade networks, and a fragmentation of political structures. And while the soil gives no opinion about the cause, the stories that survived speak of nights lit by unfamiliar stars, storms that felt unnatural, and gods who walked among humans during times of suffering. One form of memory speaks with data, the other with meaning. Yet they converge on the same impression. Something shifted the balance. Geologists studying ancient lake beds find similar signals. Lakes are particularly good archivists. They collect pollen, dust, volcanic ash, sediment from storms, and minerals left behind when water levels rise or fall. Long cores extracted from lake bottoms show periods when climates change too quickly for natural cycles to explain. Pollen records indicate sudden die-offs followed by unexpected recoveries. Layers of fine dust suggest periods of extreme dryness. Layers of dark organic matter show rapid flooding. These events sometimes align with cultural transitions, migrations, or sudden changes in settlement patterns. They also align with stories of celestial omens, unusual lights in the sky, or visitors who appeared during eras when the land seemed unfamiliar. Physics offers another perspective. Planetary interactions, even distant ones, can influence Earth's environment in ways that don't leave a single, dramatic signature. Instead, they leave a cascade of small disturbances. Gravitational forces can alter the orbit of the Moon or shift Earth's axial tilt by fractions of a degree. Changes in orbital eccentricity, even subtle ones, affect long-term climate cycles. These processes unfold slowly but with immense consequences. When scientists examine ancient ice cores extracted from Greenland or Antarctica, they find evidence of fluctuations in atmospheric composition. Layers of trapped air reveal moments when greenhouse gases rose or fell sharply. These changes don't always align with volcanic eruptions or human activity. Some correspond instead to periods of global cooling or warmth, whose causes remain partly mysterious. The physics behind these fluctuations suggest that minor shifts in Earth's orbital behaviour, or disruptions in solar radiation due to an external gravitational influence, could alter climate patterns. A passing world doesn't need to graze the Earth for its presence to be felt. It simply needs to pass near enough to tug gently on the complex systems that define Earth's equilibrium. These signals, soil, ice, sediment, pollen, minerals, don't speak in human language. They speak in patterns, and those patterns become more intriguing when compared with folklore. Many ancient stories describe the world entering a period of chaos before returning to balance. They describe cycles of destruction and renewal. They describe eras when the heavens grew bright or unfamiliar. People interpreted these events through cultural lenses rather than through physics, yet the emotional truth behind the stories often aligns with the physical disruptions recorded in the Earth itself. Consider the legends of massive fires that appear in cultures separated by oceans. In Australia, in North America, in Siberia, in southern Africa. Oral traditions speak of a time when the world burned. The soil in these regions contains charcoal layers that correspond to ancient firestorms, some caused by climate shifts and others potentially ignited by changes in atmospheric conditions. The myths describe the fires as punishments, as battles between gods, or as cleansing acts. The soil offers evidence of environmental stress. The timing matches. The interpretations differ. Flood stories behave similarly. They appear in nearly every cultural tradition. The details differ, but the core remains the same. Water rose where it never had before, and humanity struggled to survive. Geological records confirm that sea levels rose abruptly at various points in human prehistory. Meltwater pulses, rapid glacial collapses, and river surges left lasting marks in sediment layers. These events were not global in the literal sense, but they were global in the sense that many regions experienced their own catastrophic floods within similar time frames. The soil reflects this. So do the stories. Another type of signal appears in the form of chemical traces. For instance, unusual spikes in certain isotopes appear in ice cores at moments in history when the sun may have been unusually active or when Earth's magnetic field was disturbed. These spikes match periods when ancient people described celestial lights appearing unexpectedly or the sky shifting colour. Aurora activity increases when Earth's magnetic field is perturbed, whether from solar storms or from gravitational interactions with another massive object. Ancient observers had no framework for magnetic fields. They described what they saw. The sky glowed. Strange colours danced across the horizon. A visitor seemed to have arrived. Archaeology adds yet another layer. Some sites show sudden changes in dietary habits, as though a once reliable food source became scarce. Others show abrupt shifts in building styles, possibly reflecting migrations or cultural exchanges spurred by environmental changes. Still others show signs of rapid rebuilding after destruction, suggesting resilience amid crisis. These transitions often align with climatic anomalies visible in the soil. They also align with myths describing gods who taught agriculture, law, architecture, or technology during periods of upheaval. Folklore, when stripped of its dramatic embellishments, often carries faint echoes of real events. A story about a god who arrived during a drought may reflect an actual person or group who brought new farming techniques. A myth about a celestial visitor appearing before a flood may reflect memories of an unusual astronomical event, perhaps a bright object on the horizon, seen during a time of rising waters. A tale about a being who appeared only during times of suffering may symbolize the role of knowledge or leadership in navigating crisis. Yet beneath these cultural interpretations lies the persistent core. Something changed the world, and people responded. It's in this intersection between physics and folklore that the idea of a wandering world becomes compelling. Earth has always been part of a dynamic cosmic environment. It moves through regions of space filled with dust, radiation, and gravitational influences. It interacts with the moon, the sun, and distant planets. If a massive object on a long orbit passed near the solar system at irregular intervals, it could disrupt gravitational patterns just enough to influence Earth's climate or tectonics. These disruptions wouldn't always be dramatic. Sometimes they would unfold over decades or centuries. The soil would capture them, the stories would interpret them, and later generations would struggle to connect the two. The soil also keeps track of human responses. Layers with sudden charcoal might reflect desperate attempts to clear land during food shortages. Layers with fragmented pottery might reflect hurried migrations. Layers with concentrated animal bones might reflect communal feasts or rituals performed at the end of a difficult period. These material traces stand alongside stories of gods who offered guidance, signs, or warnings during times of trouble. The two forms of memory complement each other, each filling in what the other cannot say. Physics provides the mechanisms. Folklore provides the emotional truth. Archaeology provides the evidence of lived experience. Geology provides the timeline. Together they form a mosaic that hints at something larger than the sum of its pieces. If a wandering world exerted even a small gravitational pull on Earth, the soil would hold the aftermath. Riverbeds would shift. Drought periods would lengthen. Flood zones would expand. Forests would burn. Ice sheets would behave unpredictably. These shifts would leave marks in sediment cores and pollen records, yet they would not leave direct evidence of the celestial object itself. Meanwhile, myths would preserve the human viewpoint. They would describe the sky, the fear, the confusion, the sense that something beyond the ordinary had intervened. The soil doesn't know why the world changed. It only records that it did. The stories don't know the physics of why the world changed. They only know that something seemed to arrive. The convergence of these memories is what keeps the idea alive. that perhaps the disturbances woven into Earth's history weren't entirely Earth's doing. As the narrative continues, the next part moves toward the human effort to understand all of this. The skeptical minds, the curious researchers, the cautious believers, and the uncertain consensus that forms when no single explanation satisfies the puzzle left behind by stories, soil, and the strange events that connect them. Whenever a mystery lingers long enough to pass from one generation to the next, it eventually gathers followers on opposite ends of the spectrum. People who insist that nothing unusual ever happened, and people who insist that something extraordinary must have occurred. Between them lies a space less dramatic but far more interesting, the quiet middle ground where uncertainty breathes, where explanations build slowly, and where curiosity is allowed to exist without needing to choose a side. The idea that a wandering world may have passed near Earth long ago has lived in that middle ground for centuries. It's easy to find people who dismiss the idea entirely, pointing to the stability of the solar system and the reliability of orbital mechanics. It's equally easy to find those who treat ancient stories as literal accounts of celestial visitors, believing that civilizations across the globe preserved memories of a real astronomical event. But the space in between, the one rarely explored with patience, is where the story becomes more human. It's where skepticism meets imagination. It's where belief meets caution. And it's where both sides quietly agree on one thing. Something in our past didn't behave the way we expected. Skeptics tend to begin with the known rules of planetary motion. They emphasize that planets don't simply wander into new paths without leaving dramatic evidence behind. The solar system is stable. Its gravitational harmony is durable, shaped by billions of years of interaction. A massive object passing near Earth, they argue, would leave undeniable marks, tilted orbits, catastrophic geological disruptions, a trail of destruction that no soil layer could hide. They point to the absence of clear physical signatures as proof. If such a close encounter occurred, it should have carved unmistakable scars across the planet, not subtle clues that depend on interpretation. They remind us that myths exaggerate, stories evolve, oral traditions shift over time. Floods become global when retold across generations. Fires become cosmic punishment. Visitors become gods. The skeptics see mythology as metaphor, as the instinctive attempt of early people to understand the world before science offered more systematic explanations. To them, the similarities between myths in distant cultures reflect the universal human experience of living through natural disasters, not evidence of a unified celestial cause. They centre their arguments on probability, logic, and the measured confidence of data. Believers, on the other hand, assemble their case from the consistency of those very myths skeptics dismiss. They point out that so many cultures describe upheavals linked to strange appearances in the sky. They highlight the timing of collapse and migration patterns that seem to ripple across continents in overlapping windows. They emphasize the invention of calendars, star charts, and monumental architecture organized around celestial observations. To them, these are not coincidences, they are footprints. They argue that ancient societies were far more attentive to the sky than we are now, and that their descriptions of objects moving oddly, lingering too long, crossing paths in unexpected ways, reflect real experiences. Believers also note that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A passing world doesn't need to collide with Earth or approach dangerously close to influence climate patterns. Subtle, gravitational effects might alter ocean currents or atmospheric rhythms without leaving a crater or a dramatic fracture. They argue that what the skeptics call lack of proof might simply reflect the limitations of what we can interpret from the geological record. Soil remembers disturbances, but it doesn't record their cause. Stories preserve emotion, but not mechanics. Between those two kinds of memory, clarity is easy to lose, and this is where the quiet middle ground steps in. It doesn't ask for belief. It doesn't demand dismissal. It simply asks what the evidence implies, not in isolation, but woven together. It looks at soil layers that show abrupt changes, and at myths that describe upheaval. It looks at migrations that coincide with climate disruptions, and at astronomical records that reference unusual lights in the sky. It looks at the modern discovery of long-orbit exoplanets and the strange gravitational patterns in our own solar system. It doesn't force these pieces into a single conclusion. It lets them coexist as possibilities. This middle ground recognizes that ancient people were neither naive nor omniscient. They were observers of their world just as we are. They tracked the sky with consistency. They noticed when patterns broke. They responded with stories, because stories were their most reliable archive. These stories weren't always literal, yet they weren't arbitrary. They pointed toward experiences that shaped entire civilizations. Those who stand in the quiet middle understand that myths are not scientific documents, but they aren't worthless either. They're coded memories. They are psychological maps of how people interpreted the world around them. Dismissing them entirely ignores the emotional truth they preserve. Taking them literally ignores the symbolic layers that accumulate through retelling. The middle ground accepts both truths at once. That myth can reflect reality without replicating it exactly. Skeptics often argue that if a world passed near Earth, we should see repeating cycles of its return. They expect periodic disturbances, predictable patterns. But cosmic events don't always adhere to human scales. A world with an orbit stretching tens of thousands of years wouldn't leave a repeating cycle within recorded history. It might pass once within the span of early civilizations and then disappear from the inner solar system for the rest of human existence. Skeptics acknowledge this possibility, but they maintain that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in their view, the evidence isn't extraordinary enough. Believers counter that the cumulative weight of subtle clues is itself extraordinary. That stories of skyborne visitors aligning with soil records of environmental upheaval suggest a larger pattern. That the very idea of long-orbit bodies is now mainstream astronomy. That early observers described something they didn't have the vocabulary to explain. To them, this accumulation of evidence feels like a slow revelation rather than a definitive answer. But the middle ground listens to both. It accepts the caution of skepticism while recognizing the insight of belief. It doesn't rush to conclusions. It asks quieter questions instead. What if the truth lies between? What if ancient civilizations witnessed real disturbances but interpreted them through cultural lenses? What if a celestial visitor didn't need to bend the solar system out of shape to influence Earth? What if some events leave only soft footprints, small enough to argue about forever, large enough to shape the myths that followed? The people living in that middle space often include scientists who study climate patterns but remain open to unconventional triggers, archaeologists who see regional collapses and wonder whether their causes might be connected, astronomers who acknowledge unusual gravitational patterns in distant objects but hesitate to label the cause prematurely, folklorists who read myths not as literal history but as emotional cartography that points toward real disruptions. These individuals don't seek closure, they seek coherence. They ask whether multiple forms of evidence, physical, narrative, astronomical, archaeological, can coexist without forcing absolute answers. They give room for mystery, not as a failure of knowledge, but as a reminder that human understanding is always incomplete. The quiet middle ground sees the skeptic's point clearly. There is no conclusive proof of a wandering world passing near Earth. The physics of planet formation and orbital stability make such events rare. The geological record doesn't show the catastrophic signs expected from a close encounter. An Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, favours climate cycles and terrestrial causes over celestial visitors. Yet the same middle ground also notices what skeptics downplay. Climate cycles alone don't perfectly explain the timing of certain collapses. Regional disasters can't account for global mythological motifs appearing in cultures that never met. Soil disruptions sometimes cluster more tightly than expected. Ancient descriptions of strange celestial behaviour appear in multiple regions within similar time frames. These consistencies aren't proof, but they are patterns. The middle ground doesn't rush to declare a wandering world responsible, but it doesn't rush to rule it out. It recognises that cosmic events don't need to be extreme to influence the Earth. It acknowledges that early civilizations might have recorded real astronomical anomalies in the only language available to them. It accepts that environmental disruptions may have resulted from multiple overlapping forces, solar cycles, tectonic shifts, atmospheric changes, and possibly something external as well. This space between belief and dismissal is not indecisive. It's patient. It's careful. It's willing to accept that history is complex. It doesn't assume that myths are literal, nor that they are meaningless. It doesn't assume that soil tells a complete story, nor that its silence is conclusive. It doesn't assume the universe is static, nor that it behaves chaotically. It moves through uncertainty with steady steps, acknowledging the weight of evidence without forcing a final judgment. Skeptics often express frustration with the middle ground. They prefer clarity. They want definitive answers, not lingering possibilities. They point out that leaving questions open invites misinformation. They worry that narratives involving wandering worlds distract from more grounded scientific explanations. Their caution is valid. The history of interpretation is full of exaggerated claims and unfounded theories. Skepticism protects knowledge by challenging assumptions. Believers sometimes express frustration too. They feel that skepticism dismisses the emotional intelligence of ancient people, underestimates their observational skills, and ignores the consistent patterns found in their stories. They argue that scientific models evolve, and that today's impossibility may become tomorrow's accepted physics. Their persistence is valid. Many breakthroughs in science began with ideas that skeptics once mocked. The middle ground doesn't contradict either side. It absorbs both. It sees value in doubt and value in wonder. It recognizes that the skeptic's caution keeps speculation grounded, while the believer's curiosity keeps exploration alive. It creates a shared space where both can contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the past. In this shared space, the wandering world remains a possibility, not a certainty, not a fantasy, but a hypothesis that weaves together disparate threads of history. It is neither proven nor disproven. It is a lens through which to view ancient disruptions, a thought experiment connecting soil records to folklore, climate shifts to celestial events, and human resilience to cosmic scale. And that is where the story continues, not toward resolution, but toward the next layer of the puzzle. The question of whether such an event, if it happened once, could ever happen again, and how the rhythms of the cosmos might bring distant worlds into view long after the civilizations that first noticed them have faded into the quiet archive of the Earth. When people think about the deep past, it often feels like a sealed vault. Something that happened thousands of years ago can seem locked behind time, too distant to affect the present and too obscure to repeat. Yet the universe doesn't behave according to the comfort of human timelines. It follows rhythms and cycles that stretch far beyond the scope of recorded history. And if the idea of a wandering world holds even a flicker of truth, if something once drifted through the solar system close enough to influence the Earth's climate, shape migrations, unsettle societies, or spark myths about celestial visitors, then the natural question arises softly, almost reluctantly. If it happened once, could it happen again? This question doesn't demand fear, but it asks for perspective. The solar system is ancient, and its past is full of motions and encounters we're only beginning to understand. Astronomers now know that long-orbit planets exist around other stars. They've discovered worlds that spend most of their lives far from their suns, returning only once every few thousand or even tens of thousands of years. They've identified rogue planets that drift freely between stars, gravitationally unbound, moving through the galaxy with quiet indifference. These discoveries don't prove that Earth ever encountered such a world, but they prove that the concept itself is part of the natural behaviour of planets. If something like this passed near Earth once, it wouldn't be unreasonable to imagine its orbit bringing it back eventually. Or, if that object no longer existed, perhaps another could appear in its place. The difficulty lies in understanding timescales. A planet with an orbit lasting 10,000 years would have returned only a handful of times since the dawn of civilization. If its orbit stretched even longer, it might not have returned at all within human history. From the perspective of the cosmos, such patterns are normal. From the perspective of humanity, they feel like singular miracles or unforgettable catastrophes. Modern astronomy has only observed a small sliver of the sky, with the sensitivity required to detect distant, dim, slow-moving worlds. A planet far beyond Neptune, moving through the dark at an angle that hides it behind the glare of the Milky Way, or behind the plane of the ecliptic, might remain invisible for centuries. The solar system is enormous. Most of it is unexplored. The idea that another world could be travelling silently through that expanse, waiting for the moment its long arc brings it close again, is not outlandish. It is simply an acknowledgement of how incomplete our picture of the cosmos truly is. If a wandering world did return, the effects would depend entirely on its distance. No catastrophic encounter is required to produce meaningful changes. A slight gravitational tug could alter atmospheric circulation, or shift patterns in ocean behaviour. These changes would unfold slowly, just as they may have in the distant past, felt first as unusual weather patterns or disruptions to established rhythms. No glowing sign in the sky would announce the cause. People would notice the consequences long before noticing the object itself, and even then, noticing would not be guaranteed. Today we rely heavily on instruments to observe the sky. Our eyes alone would miss the faintest, most distant things. A world reflecting only a small amount of sunlight, moving against a backdrop of stars with quiet persistence, could remain unnoticed unless astronomers happen to look in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. But the question isn't only about detection, it's about possibility. The history of astronomy is full of surprises that arrived long after skeptics insisted the sky had no more surprises to give. Uranus was discovered by accident. Neptune was found through mathematics alone. Pluto appeared as a faint moving smudge, then was reclassified when new worlds were found beyond it. Entire populations of icy objects in the Kuiper Belt remained unknown until the late 20th century. The Oort cloud, the vast spherical reservoir of comets surrounding the solar system, is still purely theoretical, yet almost universally accepted. If a planet passed through that peripheral region once, nudging comets into the inner solar system, the scars of that encounter might still be visible only indirectly. The middle ground between skepticism and belief, explored earlier, becomes especially relevant here. It offers room to consider that the universe is neither hostile nor predictable. It is dynamic, it is structured, but not rigid. And within that framework, the possibility of another encounter, whether subtle or noticeable, remains open. To explore whether it could happen again, consider the mechanisms that would bring such a world into Earth's vicinity. One possibility is a highly eccentric orbit that naturally carries the object inward after long periods spent in the distant reaches of the solar system. Its return would depend on gravitational interactions with other planets, the Sun, and the vast population of icy bodies beyond Neptune. Another possibility is a rogue world drifting through interstellar space, drawn temporarily into the solar system's gravity well before continuing its trajectory towards some other destination. These scenarios are rare, but not impossible. The galaxy is full of lost worlds. Some estimates suggest there may be billions of rogue planets wandering freely, untethered to any star. For most of human existence, We lack the instruments to detect such visitors. Even today, our technology is limited. A rogue world could pass far beyond Pluto, exert a faint gravitational influence, then drift away again without ever being seen. The only trace might be changes in comet trajectories or minute adjustments in the orbits of distant objects. These signs are subtle enough that scientists debate their significance. Some see random scatter, others see a pattern that points toward a massive unseen body. If such an object approached again, it wouldn't behave like the dramatic intruder of science fiction. It wouldn't burst through the sky in a cascade of light or tear the Earth from its orbit. Instead, its presence would be felt quietly. Earth's temperature patterns might shift in ways that climate models struggle to explain. Magnetic field behavior might fluctuate slightly. Sea levels might rise unpredictably. Storm cycles might intensify in certain regions and weaken in others. These changes would accumulate, layered over natural variability, making it difficult to separate cosmic influence from terrestrial processes. And yet, over time, the changes would become clear. Not in a single year, not in a single decade, but in the gradual drift of seasons, in the small imbalances that grow until they reshape landscapes and societies. If it happened once, the traces we search for now may be the echoes of that encounter. If it happens again, future civilizations, perhaps thousands of years from now, might look back on our data as the earlier signs. But there is another aspect to consider, one that has little to do with physics and everything to do with human psychology. The ancient world responded to upheaval by creating stories of visitors, gods, or beings who arrived during times of great change. Those stories were not explanations of cosmic mechanics. They were reflections of how people felt when the world behaved unpredictably. If such an event occurred in the future, even a minor one, modern society would respond differently, but perhaps with the same underlying instinct. We might not speak of gods intervening, but we would look to the sky for answers. We would turn to satellites, observatories, and simulations. We would generate theories, debates, and models. Some would dismiss any unusual changes as terrestrial fluctuations. Others would see patterns where none exist. And somewhere between these extremes, a few would explore the possibility that the universe still holds influences we have not yet mapped. The question of recurrence also brings us to the nature of memory. Ancient myths often describe cycles, world ages that rise and fall, eras separated by catastrophes, visitors returning after long absences. These cycles may reflect natural phenomena such as climate rhythms, solar variations, or geological processes. Yet they also might echo a deeper intuition that history does not unfold in a straight line, that what happened before can happen again, not identically but in resonance. Even modern science acknowledges cycles on scales too long for individual lives to comprehend. Ice ages come and go, magnetic poles flip, continents drift, solar activity intensifies and fades. The Earth itself breathes in slow patterns. If a wandering world once added its influence to these cycles, it might simply be one thread woven into a much larger tapestry of cosmic timing. The possibility of another encounter, whether faint or profound, invites us to consider how prepared the modern world might be, not in terms of fear or defense, but in terms of understanding. We have technology to monitor the sky with precision unimaginable to ancient observers, yet we are still learning how to interpret the faintest gravitational clues. We have climate models that map trends across decades, yet we still struggle with long-range unpredictability. We have geology that reconstructs past environments, yet we continue to discover how easily those environments can shift. If the Earth were influenced again, the signs would likely emerge first in data rather than in myth. Temperature records, satellite measurements, deep-sea cores, and magnetic field sensors would show anomalies long before the sky offered visible clues. Some anomalies might already be present, waiting to be interpreted correctly. Others may appear in the future, prompting careful study rather than awe. The ancient world relied on stories to navigate uncertainty. The modern world relies on models, but both rely on patterns. And the patterns we uncover today may eventually point toward the same quiet possibility the ancients sensed, that the Earth exists not in isolation, but within a dynamic system that includes the visible planets, the invisible forces of the galaxy, and perhaps, on timescales too long for comfort, worlds that drift in and out of our neighbourhood. If a wandering object does return, its effects will depend on countless variables: distance, speed, mass, angle, timing. Some encounters might be imperceptible to human society. Others might align with cycles of environmental change, subtly intensifying them. Rarely, an encounter might be profound enough to reshape landscapes or climates. The uncertainty lies not in whether the universe could produce such events, but in how often it does and how closely the Earth has come to experiencing them. The quiet middle ground explored earlier becomes essential here. It allows for the possibility without surrendering to speculation. It acknowledges that recurrence is neither guaranteed nor impossible. It keeps the question open, not as a warning, but as a reminder of how much remains unknown. As the story moves forward, the next part turns from possibility to interpretation, how we, as humans, create meaning from uncertainty, how myths and science reflect different ways of understanding the same patterns, and how the stories we tell about wandering worlds reveal as much about ourselves as they do about the cosmos. Long before telescopes, equations, and observatories rose above the hills of human progress, people stood beneath the open sky and tried to interpret its movements the only way they could, through story. Not as entertainment, not as myth in the modern sense, but as a framework for understanding a world that shifted without warning. Stories were not simply tales. They were explanations. They were memory. They were tools that allowed people to hold the sky in their hands for a moment and shape it into something they could live with. When the world changed too quickly, stories became the bridge between what people observed and what they feared. A strange light lingering on the horizon was not just a celestial event. It was a sign that the familiar order might be unravelling. A flood that swallowed fields was not just water. It was the manifestation of a narrative already deeply woven into a culture's understanding of cosmic balance. And when harvests failed, when winds reversed their seasonal habits, when stars appeared in places they were not expected, people turned to the stories they had inherited to make sense of the change. Every culture built its stories differently, yet the themes resonate across continents and ages. The sky, with its enormous unpredictability, invited interpretation. It suggested meaning even when none was visible. And because these interpretations were shaped by human minds trying to find clarity in the shadow of uncertainty, they often reflected the same anxieties and hopes, no matter how distant the cultures were from one another. Some stories describe the sky as a map. In these traditions, each star held a place in a vast structure. The appearance of a new object could be interpreted as an addition to the map, a symbol meant to convey a warning or a shift in the order of things. When a wandering world was imagined, or perhaps witnessed, it didn't seem random. It seemed like a message. The stories helped make sense of it. Other stories cast the sky as a battlefield. In these narratives, strange celestial events were part of a cosmic struggle between forces of order and chaos. A passing body, bright or ominous, could be seen as a warrior storming across the heavens, a sign that conflict on Earth would soon follow. These stories didn't reflect astronomy. They reflected the emotional experience of living in a world where upheaval was common and unpredictable. Still others viewed the sky as a realm of teachers. In these traditions, any unexpected visitor from above became a source of knowledge. Myths described beings who descended during times of catastrophe to help humanity rebuild or adapt. Whether these beings were remembered as gods, spirits, or ancestors, the stories placed them firmly in the context of celestial change. A bright object moving across the sky wasn't merely an astronomical curiosity. It was a sign that teaching or guidance would soon follow. The stories that survive today carry these emotional frameworks with them. Some describe floods that erased entire worlds, reflecting memories of real inundations preserved as narrative anchors. Others speak of fiery events that scorched landscapes, echoing volcanic eruptions or firestorms recorded in soil layers. Still others describe darkened skies, sudden climate shifts, or seasons out of rhythm, all phenomena now understood through science, yet preserved in myths as the actions of gods or cosmic visitors. These stories persisted because they gave people something to hold on to. They transformed fear into structure. They allowed communities to imagine that the forces shaping their lives were part of a story too vast to grasp, but not too vast to narrate. And in making sense of the sky-through story, ancient people created systems of meaning that helped them endure uncertainty. Even now, with our satellites and simulations, the instinct to create stories from the sky hasn't disappeared. It has simply changed form. We no longer imagine gods pulling stars across the heavens, but we create narratives around black holes, dark matter, and long-distance worlds whose orbits stretch across millennia. These narratives aren't framed as myth. They are framed as science, yet they serve a similar purpose. They help us understand a cosmos that is too large, too complex, too distant to fully comprehend. When scientists discuss hypothetical planets lurking beyond Neptune, they use the language of mathematics and measurement. But beneath the calculations lives the same impulse that guided ancient storytellers. They're trying to make sense of patterns that don't align with expectations. They're trying to explain anomalies in the movements of distant objects. They are narrating the sky in a different dialect. Similarly, when people speculate about wandering worlds, the stories they create are not that different from the ones carved into stone thousands of years ago. They merge physical observations with emotional truths. They reflect uncertainty, curiosity, hope, and fear. They attempt to place humanity in a cosmos that feels simultaneously indifferent and intimately connected to our fate. Some of the most enduring myths arise from periods when the sky appeared unpredictable. Comets, eclipses, auroras, meteor storms. Each of these phenomena pushed ancient people to create meaning. A comet that appeared during a time of drought became a messenger. An eclipse during a political crisis became a sign of judgment. A meteor shower became the shedding of sparks from celestial weapons. These interpretations weren't incorrect in the sense that myths aren't attempts at literal accuracy. They were attempts at emotional accuracy. They captured the feeling of living through uncertainty. When environmental upheavals and celestial anomalies overlapped, the stories grew even more vivid. A flood following the appearance of an unusual object in the sky became a legend. A drought occurring during a strange alignment of planets became a myth. A period of migration coinciding with celestial disturbances became a cycle of stories explaining why entire peoples moved across the land. These stories preserved memory in a form that could outlast language, script, kingdoms, and even the physical landscapes that shaped them. Not all stories were meant to comfort. Some warned. They described cycles of destruction, worlds destroyed by fire or water, ages ending abruptly. These stories may reflect real cycles in the Earth's past: volcanic eruptions, climate collapse, impacts from space, or extreme droughts. They were not predictions so much as interpretations of events that left deep scars on collective memory. Other stories looked forward rather than backward. They described returns, not beginnings. They suggested that what came once could come again. Civilizations that imagined recurring ages often did so because they recognized patterns in their environment. They saw climates shift repeatedly. They witnessed one society rise, collapse, and be replaced by another. They saw the sky cycle through predictable motions, but they also recognized anomalies that didn't fit any known pattern. A visitor in the sky became a recurring character, not a one-time event. When modern people read these stories, it's easy to classify them as mythology, distant from science and unrelated to physical truth. Yet the boundary between story and observation was never as firm as modern perspectives suggest. Early astronomers were also storytellers. Their records blended empirical observation with symbolic meaning. Their interpretations relied on measurements, but also on cultural frameworks shaped by the narratives of their time. They were scientists and storytellers at the same moment. Even today, the boundary between story and science remains permeable. Scientists use metaphors, cosmic webs, stellar nurseries, black hole horizons, to explain phenomena that cannot be visualized directly. Journalists translate discoveries into narratives. Documentaries turn observations into arcs of wonder. People on the streets imagine planets, stars, and galaxies through images and stories rather than equations. We still use story to understand the sky. The universal need for explanation stretches across all of human history. It doesn't matter whether the explanation comes in the form of myth or mathematics. The impulse is the same. Something appears in the sky. Something shifts in the world. Something stirs curiosity. And people reach for whatever tools they have — story, measurement, ritual, analysis — to make sense of it. The idea of a wandering world passing near Earth is a perfect example of this blending of story and science. For skeptics, it remains a narrative shaped by imagination. For believers, it remains a possibility supported by the echoes of the myth. For those in the quiet middle ground, it remains a hypothesis worth considering because it aligns with both physical plausibility and narrative memory. The sky sends signals, subtle or dramatic, and humanity responds by creating meaning. These responses are not simply artifacts of ancient thought. They continue today. When scientists discuss hypothetical Planet 9, they are constructing a narrative based on the best data available. When people speculate about unusual climate anomalies influenced by cosmic factors, they are exploring possibilities that merge human intuition with scientific uncertainty. When researchers examine ancient texts for astronomical references, they are trying to decipher how early observers recorded celestial events. In this way, the stories we tell to understand the sky become part of a larger dialogue between the past and the present. They link ancient observation to modern theory. They allow us to imagine connections between soil signals, climate cycles, orbital mechanics, and mythology. They remind us that the universe has always been far larger than the tools available to measure it, and as this journey approaches its final movement, the next part turns toward why the idea endures, why a wandering world, whether real or imagined, continues to haunt human imagination, inviting us to look upward with the same mixture of fear and wonder that shaped the earliest stories ever told. For all our science, our satellites, our equations, and our confident diagrams of the solar system, there remains a quiet, persistent feeling that the universe is still larger than we understand. It's not the loud kind of mystery that demands attention. It's the soft kind that settles into the edges of thought, the kind that lingers after a documentary ends, or after a late-night walk under a sky that feels too deep to name. And it's in that soft space, between certainty and wonder, that the idea of a wandering world continues to live. It doesn't matter whether someone believes such a world ever passed near Earth. The idea remains strangely compelling. It follows us not because of proof, but because of what it represents. The possibility that something immense, indifferent, and ancient could have brushed close enough to influence our weather, our migrations, our stories, and our history, without ever touching us directly. A presence so large it would never need to announce itself. A visitor that could change everything simply by passing through. People don't cling to this idea because they want catastrophe. They cling to it because it evokes something deep in the human mind. The awareness that we exist on a small world inside a much larger one, and that the larger world does not revolve around us. Most of the time, this awareness hides beneath the routines of daily life, but occasionally it surfaces, either from a scientific discovery or from an ancient story retold, and for a moment we realize how thin the boundary is between our sense of control and the vastness beyond it. A wandering world, whether real or imagined, reminds us that the universe is full of motions we cannot predict. It reminds us that Earth is not anchored to anything except the gravity holding everything else together. It reminds us that cycles larger than civilization might exist, cycles that outlast languages, empires, continents, even species. When ancient people sensed these cycles, they preserved them as myth. When modern people sense them, they preserve them as speculation or science fiction, or quiet questions that sit at the back of the mind. Part of what makes the idea so haunting is that it blends the distant with the intimate. A planet far beyond human reach, moving on a path that spans millennia, feels remote enough to ignore. Yet if its presence once altered climates, shifted migrations, or inspired stories of gods descending during turmoil, then it becomes personal. It enters our cultural memory. It becomes a shadow cast across human history. And in acknowledging that possibility, we recognize that the universe shapes us even when we don't notice. There's another reason the idea persists. People instinctively search for patterns, especially in the face of uncertainty. Ancient collapses, sudden migrations, unexplained climate shifts. They don't feel random when viewed collectively. They feel rhythmic, almost like a pulse. Folklore preserves these pulses symbolically. Soil preserves them physically. Science interprets them mechanistically. And the idea of a wandering world becomes a way to weave these interpretations together. Not as a definitive explanation, but as a framework that allows disparate clues to sit in the same room without contradiction. Humans have always lived between two impulses, the desire for stability and the fascination with what lies beyond it. The sky has always fed both impulses at once. It offers a predictable rhythm, sunrise, sunset, seasons, cycles, and yet it also offers the unexpected. A comet where none belonged, an eclipse that darkened the day, a meteor shower that filled the night with motion. A wandering world fits naturally into this duality. It is predictable in its long rhythm, yet unpredictable within any single lifetime. It is stable in its orbit, yet destabilizing when it draws near. It sits exactly in the place where human imagination thrives. The idea also resonates because it speaks to our earliest memories as a species. For thousands of years, people lived beneath skies untouched by city lights, where every star was a companion and every anomaly a subject of deep attention. A faint glow moving too slowly to be a meteor, and too oddly to be a known planet, would have held unimaginable significance. It would have been remembered. It would have been integrated into story and ritual. The memory of such an event, or even the memory of something misinterpreted as such, could survive for millennia through myth. And even if no such event ever occurred, the idea remains appealing because it allows modern people to connect with that ancient mindset. A reminder that the sky once felt alive with possibility. Even now, despite technological advances, the universe continues to surprise us. Entire classes of planets were discovered only in the last few decades. Objects larger than Pluto have been found in the outer solar system. Evidence for a potential unseen massive body far beyond Neptune continues to spark debate. The fact that we have not mapped every large object in our own system lends quiet weight to the idea that something could have passed through long ago, influencing Earth without leaving an obvious trail. Yet the haunting quality of the idea doesn't come from fear of what such a world might do. It comes from the recognition that the cosmos moves independently of human concerns. A wandering world does not descend to punish or reward. It does not respond to prayers, sacrifices, or scientific models. It simply follows its path, shaped by the gravitational symphony of the solar system. That indifference is strangely beautiful, even comforting. It reminds us that the universe is not hostile, just vast, and that Earth has always existed within its shifting currents. There's also a quieter layer beneath the scientific and mythic aspects of the idea. A wandering world invites us to consider how fragile memory is. If something so massive could influence Earth, and yet leave only scattered hints, stories, soil signatures, puzzling migrations, then what else has happened that we no longer remember? What parts of history unfolded under forces invisible to the people who lived through them? What explanations have been lost, replaced with stories that kept only the emotional truth? Humans often assume that the present is the most informed era in history. We compare the past to our current knowledge and see gaps. But the idea of a wandering world reminds us that there may still be gaps in our own understanding, shaped not by ignorance but by perspective. We see the universe through tools and models that reflect our current capabilities. Future generations may see it differently. They may discover objects whose orbits we never knew, influences we never detected, patterns we never imagined. And in doing so, they may reinterpret the same stories we examine now. The idea haunts us because it connects these layers, past, present, and future, into a single quiet thread. It acknowledges that we live in a universe where enormous forces exist alongside fragile human interpretations. It allows ancient myths and modern science to sit together without the need to choose one over the other. It treats uncertainty not as a flaw, but as a space where imagination and inquiry coexist. Some people find the idea comforting. It makes the universe feel alive, dynamic, filled with possibilities yet undiscovered. Others find it unsettling, a reminder that Earth is not shielded from cosmic influence. Most people, however, simply find it intriguing, not because they expect a wandering world to return, but because the idea speaks to a timeless part of the human mind, the part that looks at the sky and senses that something larger than life exists beyond the reach of understanding. A wandering world is not only a celestial object, it is a concept that gathers every unanswered question into one image. It represents the unknown in a form that is neither terrifying nor trivial. It suggests that the universe holds mysteries that are not meant to be solved quickly. It gives shape to the gap between evidence and interpretation. Even if no such world ever existed, the idea carries weight because it captures the essence of how humans relate to the cosmos. We stand on a small planet, surrounded by forces we cannot control, searching for meaning in the patterns we see and the disruptions we feel. A wandering world becomes a symbol of that relationship, vast, distant, influencing us without ever needing to touch us directly. As the path continues, this idea doesn't close anything. It leaves the door open, inviting the mind to linger on the possibility that the universe remains full of slow-moving stories that outlast civilizations, waiting quietly in the dark until their arcs intersect with ours once again.